Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where old stones get a little attention, unanswered questions are allowed to stay unanswered for a while, and history takes the scenic route towards sleep. Tonight, we are travelling to Japan, a country often associated with crowded cities, quiet temples, high-speed trains, careful craftsmanship and convenient stores that seem capable of providing almost anything a person could require at 3 a.m. Yet beyond the bright streets and familiar landmarks lies another Japan, one made of immense stones, artificial caves, enormous tombs, strange carvings, flooded terraces and monuments whose original purpose is still uncertain. Some of these places are known to millions. Others sit quietly beside roads, beneath forests, behind temples, or inside landscapes that most visitors pass without realizing what they are looking at. A block of stone may appear to be part of a hill until you notice that its sides have been cut into clear plains. A mountain may seem natural until you find chambers, corridors, and tool marks disappearing into its interior. A peaceful mound covered with trees may look like an ordinary patch of greenery, yet from the air it becomes a vast keyhole-shaped tomb surrounded by water. Far beneath the sea, broad platforms and steps appear to rise from the ocean floor, leaving geologists and archaeologists arguing over whether nature, people, or some combination of the two produced them. The question waiting behind all of these places is simple enough to ask, but much harder to answer. Who built Japan's ancient megastructures? Before we begin, where are you listening from tonight? Perhaps you are somewhere close to Japan, where some of these places may feel almost familiar. Perhaps you're on the other side of the world, settled beneath a blanket while the streets outside have gone quiet. And have you ever stood beside an old structure and felt that the official explanation, even if it was reasonable, did not quite remove the mystery? Sometimes knowing the date of a monument does not tell us what it meant. Sometimes knowing which culture lived nearby does not reveal exactly how the work was organised. History can label a place, measure it, protect it, and still leave its deepest questions resting inside the stone. If you find this kind of slow journey soothing, intriguing, or simply helpful when the day has been a little too noisy, I would be very grateful if you gave the video a like and perhaps subscribe to Just About Earth. It helps this quiet corner reach other listeners who may also enjoy falling asleep while thinking about ancient engineering, lost kingdoms and very large stones that were somehow moved into places where large stones had no obvious intention of going. Now settle in, allow the room around you to grow still, and let us begin with the landscape itself. Japan is an island chain shaped by powerful geological forces. Mountains rise sharply. Earthquakes rearrange the ground. Volcanoes build new layers of rock while rivers and rain steadily wear them away. In a place like this, stone is never merely decoration. It is part of the land's personality. It can be useful, dangerous, sacred, and inconvenient, sometimes all during the same afternoon. Human communities have lived among these islands for a very long time. The archaeological record includes cultures stretching back thousands of years before written histories began. The Jomon people, whose long presence in Japan is known through pottery, settlements, tools, ornaments, burials and distinctive figurines, lived through enormous changes in climate and coastline. Their world was not the Japan shown on a modern map. Sea levels shifted, forests moved, islands changed shape. Places that are now underwater were once dry ground, while areas that are now inland once faced the sea. This matters because history is often built upon whatever happens to survive. A wooden building can rot. A settlement beside an old coastline may disappear beneath water or sediment. Tools can be broken and reused. Stories can be altered each time they are told. Stone lasts longer, although even stone does not explain itself. Across Japan, enormous works in stone seem to belong to different periods and different purposes. Some are clearly connected to known historical construction. Others are far more difficult to interpret. Their ages may be debated, their functions uncertain, and their relationship to surrounding cultures incomplete. When these sites are gathered together, they create an unusual picture. Japan contains quarries large enough to transform mountains, tombs large enough to reshape entire districts, stone chambers assembled from blocks weighing many tons, carved monuments that resemble unfinished machines, and underwater formations that look startlingly architectural from certain angles. One of the most striking examples rises at Mount Nokogiri in Chiba Prefecture. Its name is often translated as Saw Mountain because its ridgeline resembles the teeth of a saw. For centuries, the mountain was quarried for stone. Workers cut deep into the slopes, leaving vertical walls, narrow passages, exposed chambers, and sharp geometric surfaces. From a distance, the mountain can appear natural. Up close, the scale of human removal becomes difficult to ignore. The stone extracted there was used in buildings, walls, roads, and other projects, especially as nearby cities expanded. Quarry workers relied on traditional tools and methods, often labouring in conditions that would make a modern office complaint about the air conditioning seem rather delicate. Blocks had to be identified, separated, shaped, lowered, and transported without the machinery now used in large-scale mining. The marks left behind create a record of organised effort, but they also show how easily human activity can merge with geology. After quarrying stops, vegetation returns, rain softens edges, moss covers tool marks. Within a few generations, an industrial landscape begins to look ancient and mysterious. Mount Nokogiri is not evidence of a civilization before the last ice age. Its known quarrying history belongs largely to much later periods. Yet it offers an important lesson for everything that follows. People using relatively simple technology can transform a mountain on an extraordinary scale when they have skilled workers, strong organisation, enough time, and a determined reason for doing so. Human beings have always been remarkably inventive when faced with a large piece of rock and the firm belief that it ought to be somewhere else. Farther inland, the Oya Stone Quarry presents an even stranger underground world. Near Utsunomiya, generations of quarrying created enormous chambers beneath the ground. Columns of rock remain to support high ceilings. Walls are covered in lines and rectangular scars where blocks were removed. The air is cool, and the space feels less like a mine than a buried hall constructed for giants with a particular interest in masonry. Oya stone is a soft volcanic rock that is relatively easy to cut when first exposed. It became a popular building material, and the quarry grew into a vast network. The surviving underground chambers demonstrate both manual quarrying and later mechanized extraction. Looking into that enormous interior, it is easy to understand how legends begin. Remove the written records, abandon the site for several centuries, allow the entrances to collapse, and future explorers might struggle to believe it was created simply to supply building stone. That thought follows us toward older and less easily explained sites. Near the town of Takasago rests Ishi-no-Hoden, a massive stone object carved directly from the surrounding bedrock. It appears to float above a pool of water because the centre beneath it has been cut away, leaving the enormous block supported in a way that is not immediately obvious. Its surfaces form broad, deliberate angles. One side rises like a sloping roof, while the back contains projections that make the entire object resemble a component from some oversized device whose instructions were unfortunately misplaced. Traditional accounts connect the site with ancient deities and sacred history. Archaeological interpretations often suggest that it may have been intended as a monument or tomb element that was never completed. The stone was not transported into place. It was shaped from the rock already there, which removes one engineering puzzle while introducing several others. Why choose that form? Why leave it unfinished? Was the final design interrupted, abandoned, or always meant to appear as it does now? There is no clear evidence that Ishi-no-Hoden is prehistoric in the extreme sense sometimes claimed online. Its likely cultural setting is usually placed within Japan's historic or proto-historic past rather than a lost Ice Age civilization. Even so, the absence of a surviving explanation leaves space for speculation. People look at its size, the water around its base, and the sharpness of its form, then imagine ancient machinery, energy devices, or inherited technology. Stone can be very patient with human imagination. It never interrupts to correct us. In the Asuka region, several carved stones add to the uncertainty. Sakafune-ishi is a large slab marked with channels, circular depressions and branching grooves. Its name is often linked with sake, leading to suggestions that it may have been used for brewing or pressing. Other interpretations connect it with ritual water, medicine, astronomical observation, gardens, or ceremonies associated with the nearby imperial centre. The design looks functional. Liquid could certainly flow through its channels, yet resemblance is not proof. A kitchen sink also contains channels and basins, but no one has yet claimed it was designed to track the movement of Venus, although given enough centuries and a sufficiently dramatic documentary, someone probably will. Near Sakafune-ishi, archaeologists have discovered stone waterworks that strengthen the idea that the area had ceremonial or practical systems involving controlled water. This does not settle the purpose of every carved feature, but it places the object in a landscape of organised construction rather than isolation. Ancient monuments become easier to misunderstand when removed from their surroundings. A single stone can look like an impossible machine. Put it beside drains, foundations, pathways, and associated buildings, and it begins to look like one piece of a larger human setting. Kame-ishi, or the turtle stone, is another famous object in Asuka. It is a large carved boulder with a face and body resembling a turtle. Local traditions warn that if the stone ever turns completely toward a certain direction, disaster may follow. For now, it remains where it is, apparently content to avoid the paperwork involved in causing the end of the world. Its original date and purpose are uncertain. It may have been decorative, symbolic, religious, or connected with a nearby site that no longer survives. The turtle has long associations with longevity, direction, water, and cosmology in East Asian traditions, but the specific meaning of this stone has been lost. What survives is the object and the stories gathered around it. Not far away lies Masuda-no-Iwafune, the so-called rock ship of Masuda. This enormous block of granite has been carved into a squared shape with two rectangular openings on its upper surface. It sits on a slope surrounded by trees, looking as though a giant stone container was set down and forgotten. Proposed explanations include a tomb, an astronomical observation platform, a ritual monument, or an unfinished structure. Some researchers have connected it with known burial practices, while others point to alignment possibilities involving the sun. Alternative history discussions often describe it as evidence of advanced machining, because of its geometry and the difficulty of carving hard granite. Yet no lost tools are required to explain that stone can be worked slowly with harder materials, abrasives, repeated striking, fire, water, wedges, and an inconvenient amount of patience. The real mystery is not whether ancient people were capable of shaping it. They clearly were. The problem is understanding why they chose that particular design, and why the work appears incomplete. Modern observers often treat unfinished ancient monuments as failed projects, but abandonment can happen for many reasons. A patron may die, political control may change, a flaw may appear in the stone, workers may be redirected, the site may become sacred before completion, or its function may never have required the form we expect. Japan's ancient tombs move the question from individual stones to landscapes engineered on an enormous scale. Ishibutai Kofun, also in Asuka, contains one of the largest exposed stone burial chambers in the country. Massive rocks form walls and a roof over the chamber. The earthen mound that once covered it has largely disappeared, leaving the stone structure open to view. The chamber is often associated with Soga no Umako, a powerful figure from the late 6th and early 7th centuries, although certainty is difficult. The upper stones are immense. Their placement required planning, labour, ramps, leverage and coordination. They do not fit together with modern industrial precision, but they did not need to. Their purpose was to create a stable chamber beneath a mound, not to impress future engineers examining close-up photographs on the internet. Even so, standing beneath such blocks changes the way the site feels. Written descriptions turn stone into numbers. Being inside the chamber restores its weight. Someone selected each block, moved it, positioned it, and trusted that it would remain overhead. It has done so for roughly 14 centuries, which is a respectable record for any construction project, and considerably better than some flat-pack wardrobes manage over a weekend. The largest tombs are even more difficult to understand from ground level. The Mozu and Furuichi groups around Osaka contain many kofun, large burial mounds, constructed mainly between the 3rd and 6th centuries. Some are round, some are square. The most famous are shaped like keyholes when seen from above, with a circular rear mound joined to a broad rectangular front. Daisen Kofun, traditionally associated with Emperor Nintoku, is among the largest tombs in the world by area. It is surrounded by moats and covered with vegetation, so from nearby streets it can resemble a wooded island. Only aerial views reveal its full geometry. Constructing it required the movement of an extraordinary volume of earth, careful surveying, water management, organisation of labour, and a political system capable of sustaining a project across years. The identity of the individual buried there has not been confirmed through modern excavation. Many imperial tombs are protected by the Imperial Household Agency, and archaeological access is limited. This creates understandable tension. The sites are culturally and spiritually important, but they are also major sources of information about early Japan. Without extensive excavation, questions about construction stages, burials, grave goods, and exact dating remain partly unresolved. This lack of access can encourage more dramatic theories. When a tomb cannot be opened, it becomes easier to imagine that something extraordinary lies inside. Secret chambers, unknown rulers, advanced tools, lost records, and occasionally objects that appear to have arrived from somewhere beyond Earth all become possibilities in the public imagination. The reality may be historically important without being supernatural. Royal regalia, weapons, mirrors, ornaments, bones, wooden structures, and evidence of political connections could transform our knowledge of early Japan, even if no ancient power generator is found humming politely beneath the mound. An especially remarkable stone connected with later Japanese construction is the Octopus Stone in the walls of Osaka Castle. It is a vast block fitted into the fortifications, named for a pattern on its surface said to resemble an octopus. The castle's great stones were transported and installed during the early 17th century under the Tokugawa shogunate. Their presence shows that extremely large stonework does not automatically require unknown technology. Historical records, quarry sites, stone marks, transport routes, and construction traditions help explain how such blocks were managed. Labour forces used sledges, rollers, boats, ropes, ramps, levers, and coordinated effort. The methods were difficult, but difficulty is not impossibility. A society with political power can persuade thousands of people to solve engineering problems that one person standing beside a boulder would reasonably decide to leave for another day. Osaka Castle also raises the possibility that stones may have been reused, relocated, or taken from earlier structures. Reuse is common throughout history. New rulers inherit old foundations. Temples become quarries. Tombstones become walls. Sacred objects are moved and reinterpreted. Later cultures do not always destroy earlier monuments. Sometimes they absorb them, rename them, and build their own stories around them. This may explain part of the uncertainty surrounding Japan's ancient stone sites. A monument can pass through several phases. It may begin as a quarry face, become a ritual place, acquire a legend, and later be presented as an archaeological mystery. Each generation adds meaning while the original purpose grows less accessible. The idea that later Japanese cultures inherited monuments from a much older civilization is compelling because inheritance does happen. The harder claim is that the builders belong to a technologically advanced civilization before the end of the last ice age. At present, the archaeological evidence for such a civilization in Japan is not established. There are very ancient human sites and rich Jomon traditions, but no confirmed prehistoric cities equipped with advanced stone machinery, metal industries, or infrastructure matching the more dramatic proposals. Still, the question is worth examining carefully because the absence of evidence can have several causes. Coastlines from the Ice Age are now underwater, organic materials decay, earthquakes destroy settlements, volcanic eruptions bury landscapes, later construction removes earlier layers. Japan's geography is especially effective at rearranging the archaeological record. This brings us to Yonaguni, the underwater formation near Japan's westernmost inhabited island. Divers discovered large stepped surfaces, broad terraces, straight edges, channels, and what appear to be walls lying beneath the sea. To some observers, the site looks unmistakably artificial, like the remains of a ceremonial complex or drowned city. Others argue that the formation is natural sandstone fractured along plains, shaped by currents, earthquakes, and erosion. The debate has continued because both sides can point to visible features supporting their view. Nature produces surprisingly regular geometry. Rock layers crack along straight lines, waves carve platforms, tectonic movement can create dramatic steps. At the same time, human beings frequently modify natural formations rather than constructing everything from the beginning. A natural terrace could have been cut, cleared, used, or expanded by people when sea levels were lower. If Yonaguni contains human modification, the crucial questions would concern its date and extent. Was it altered recently enough to fit known regional cultures? Could it reflect activity during a period of lower sea level? Are loose stones nearby tools, architectural fragments, or ordinary rock? Without decisive artifacts embedded in secure archaeological layers, the structure remains open to interpretation. The attraction of Yonaguni becomes stronger when it is compared with sites elsewhere. At Pumapunku in Bolivia, enormous carved blocks display complex shapes and careful surfaces. At Baalbek in Lebanon, gigantic stones form part of Roman and pre-Roman construction. In China, the Yangshan Quarry contains massive unfinished stone components, while the Longyu Caves and Huashan Grottos reveal vast quantities of rock removed to create underground spaces. Egypt, Peru, Turkey, and many other regions contain stonework that seems astonishing when viewed without the tools, labour systems, and cultural goals that produced it. These similarities invite the idea of a forgotten global civilization. Perhaps, the argument suggests, one advanced culture travelled across the world teaching stoneworking, astronomy, architecture, and sacred design. A disaster at the end of the Ice Age may have destroyed its cities, leaving survivors to pass fragments of knowledge to later peoples. It is an exciting possibility, but similarity alone does not prove connection. Humans in different places face similar physical problems. Stone blocks are stable, mounds are visible, caves provide shelter and ritual space. Circular and rectangular forms are easy to measure. Alignments with the sun are useful and meaningful in agricultural societies. Independent cultures can develop comparable solutions without contact, just as people in different kitchens may independently discover that dropping a heavy jar onto a foot produces a very similar reaction. The more careful question is not whether all megalithic sites share one builder, but how each society achieved its own work. What tools were available? How was labour organised? Which materials were chosen? What beliefs justified the effort? Which parts of the monument are original and which were repaired or reused? These questions may sound less dramatic than a vanished global empire, yet they often reveal something more impressive. Ancient builders did not require modern cranes to be intelligent. They developed methods suited to their materials, environments, and social systems. Japan's unusual artifacts add another layer to the story. Dog figurines created during the Yomon period often have exaggerated eyes, broad bodies, intricate patterns and shapes unlike natural human anatomy. Some modern writers have compared them with people wearing helmets, goggles, or protective suits. From that perspective, they appear to represent visitors equipped with advanced technology. Archaeologists generally interpret dog through ritual, symbolic, social, and artistic contexts. Many appear connected with fertility, healing, protection, identity, or ceremonial breaking. Their unusual features may not represent literal clothing at all. Ancient art does not always aim to reproduce the world realistically. A figure can combine human, animal, spiritual, and symbolic elements without being a portrait of someone who arrived in a spacecraft. Yet the fascination remains because dog are genuinely strange to modern eyes. They remind us that the minds of ancient people cannot be reconstructed simply by looking at an object and asking what it resembles today. A large eye might represent vision, ancestry, sleep, a spirit, an animal, a mask, or something whose meaning has no modern equivalent. Calling it a pair of goggles may say more about our world than theirs. The Utsurabun legend creates a similar temptation. Early 19th century Japanese accounts describe a strange hollow vessel that came ashore carrying an unfamiliar woman. Illustrations show a rounded craft with windows or panels and markings that witnesses could not read. Modern readers sometimes interpret the story as an early encounter with an unidentified flying object or advanced visitor. More conventional explanations treat it as folklore influenced by foreign ships, castaway stories, popular entertainment, or anxiety about outsiders during Japan's period of restricted international contact. The vessel may have been imaginary, exaggerated, or inspired by European designs. The woman's appearance and unknown language could reflect perceptions of foreigners rather than extraterrestrial origins. Its inclusion in a story about ancient megastructures may seem unusual, but it reveals how lost history is often assembled. Stones, figurines, legends, queens, submerged formations and unexplained objects become pieces of a single imagined puzzle. Once placed together, they seem to support one another. The danger is that each mystery may come from a completely different period and context. A Yomon figurine, a 19th century tale, and a 7th century carved stone do not automatically belong to one continuous hidden civilization. Queen Himiko and the Lost Kingdom of Yamate occupy a more firmly historical mystery. Chinese records describe Himiko as a ruler associated with ritual authority, who governed a polity in ancient Japan during the 3rd century. Scholars have long debated where Yamatai was located, with major arguments favouring regions in Kyushu or the Kinai area around Nara. Archaeological discoveries have provided clues, but no single piece of evidence has ended the debate. Tombs, settlements, mirrors, trade networks, and dates can be interpreted in different ways. The uncertainty affects how historians understand the formation of early Japanese political power. Yamatai may have been connected with the society that later developed into the Yamato state, or it may represent a competing centre whose history was absorbed and rewritten. Here the mystery is not a forgotten civilization from 12,000 years ago, but a kingdom described in written sources whose exact location remains uncertain. That alone should make us humble. If scholars can still debate the centre of a powerful society from less than 2,000 years ago, reconstructing cultures from the end of the Ice Age becomes even more difficult. Japan's ancient megastructures therefore sit between what is known, what is probable, and what remains possible. We know that generations of skilled workers quarried mountains, moved enormous stones, built great tombs, shaped water systems, and carved monuments whose purposes were important enough to justify extraordinary labour. We know that Japan's early cultures were complex, connected through trade, capable of large-scale organisation, and deeply engaged with ritual landscapes. What we do not always know is who designed a specific monument, why a project stopped, how later cultures changed a site, what disappeared from the surrounding landscape, or how much information remains beneath protected tombs and coastal waters. Those gaps are real. They do not prove a lost global civilization, but they leave room for continued investigation, and perhaps that is the most useful place to begin. Not with the claim that every unusual stone must overturn history, and not with the assumption that conventional explanations have already solved everything, but with a patient look at the evidence. Japan's ancient remains deserve more than quick dismissal, yet they also deserve more than being turned into props for a conclusion chosen in advance. To understand how such monuments could appear, we need to travel much farther back than castles, imperial tombs, and written chronicles. We need to meet the people who lived in Japan thousands of years before the first rulers recorded their names, people who created some of the world's earliest pottery, built settled communities, travelled by sea, shaped ritual objects, and adapted to dramatic changes in climate and coastline. Their figurines still stare at us with enormous eyes. Their settlements lie beneath modern fields and towns. Their coastal world has partly vanished below rising water. And although they're usually described as hunters, fishers, gatherers, and early village builders, the long span of Jomon culture may hold important clues about how deep Japan's forgotten history truly reaches. Long before Japan had emperors, castles, written chronicles, or cities arranged around railway stations, people were already living across its islands. They knew the forests, rivers, coastlines, and changing seasons in ways that are difficult to recover from broken tools and buried hearths. They left no books explaining what they called themselves. No surviving map shows the boundaries of their communities. Their leaders, stories, and personal names have almost entirely disappeared. What remains is pottery, stone, bone, shell, lacquer, graves, house foundations, food waste, ritual objects, and thousands of small clay figures staring back at us with faces that seem both human and unfamiliar. We call these people the Jomon, although they would never have used that name. The word comes from the cord-like impressions found on much of their pottery. Wet clay was pressed or rolled with cord, creating patterned surfaces before the vessels were fired. This decorative technique became so closely associated with the period that it eventually provided a name for an enormous stretch of Japanese prehistory lasting more than 10,000 years. Depending on the dating system being used, its beginnings reach back to around 16,000 years ago, while its final phases continued until roughly 3,000 years ago, when farming communities and new technologies associated with the Yayoi period began spreading through much of the archipelago. Calling this a single culture can be slightly misleading. 10,000 years is an almost unreasonable amount of time. It is longer than the entire span separating the first cities of Mesopotamia from the modern world. Languages can rise and disappear in far less time. Religions can change, populations can move, and entire coastlines can be rearranged. The earliest Jomon communities and the people living near the end of the period would not have shared exactly the same customs, any more than a person in modern Tokyo lives like someone in the same region 10,000 years ago. Placing them beneath one label is useful for archaeology, but it can make their world appear more uniform than it really was. The earliest pottery associated with this broad tradition appeared while the planet was still emerging from the last ice age. At the Odai Yamamoto site in northern Honshu, pottery fragments dating to around 13,000 years before the Common Era show evidence of cooking. These are among the earliest known pottery remains in Northeast Asia. Their existence is important because pottery was once strongly associated with settled farming societies. The Jomon record demonstrated that hunting, fishing, and gathering communities could also make and use ceramic vessels long before rice fields became central to Japanese life. A clay pot may not sound like advanced technology. It does not glow, move on its own, or require a mysterious crystal to operate, yet it transforms daily life. A waterproof container can hold water, store food, render fat, soften roots, boil shellfish, prepare stews, and process ingredients that might otherwise be difficult or unsafe to eat. Chemical studies of residues preserved in early pottery indicate that aquatic foods were often cooked in Jomon vessels. Fish and other marine resources were not merely collected and eaten beside the shore. They could be processed, mixed, stored, and prepared in ways that made food supplies more reliable. Pottery also changes movement. A community carrying only light tools can relocate fairly easily. A community surrounded by large ceramic vessels, storage pits, prepared houses, graves, and established food processing areas has more reasons to remain. This does not mean every Jomon group settled permanently in one village. People moved seasonally, visited hunting grounds, travelled to collect stone and shell, and maintained relationships between regions. But many communities became far more settled than the old picture of wandering hunter-gatherers suggested. The 17 Jomon sites in northern Japan recognised by UNESCO preserve evidence of sedentary communities living without depending on full-scale agriculture. The sites include pit dwellings, cemeteries, storage areas, shell mounds, stone circles, artificial mounds, and ritual spaces. Together, they show societies developing stable settlements and complex ceremonial traditions while drawing food from forests, rivers, wetlands, and coasts. This way of life depended on detailed environmental knowledge. Jomon communities hunted deer and wild boar. They caught fish, gathered shellfish, collected nuts, used plants, and managed resources around their settlements. Dogs were kept, and sometimes carefully buried, suggesting that they were valued beyond their usefulness as mobile alarm systems with strong opinions about squirrels. In eastern Honshu, evidence connects dog burials with hunting traditions, indicating that these animals may have played important roles in obtaining terrestrial game. The forests were not untouched wilderness. People burned vegetation, cut wood, encouraged useful plants, harvested nuts, and altered the areas around settlements. Chestnuts were especially important in some regions. They could provide wood, fuel, and dependable food that could be stored after processing. Such practices did not resemble modern industrial farming, but neither were they passive. The Jomon shaped their surroundings while allowing forests and wetlands to continue producing a wide range of resources. This is one reason the usual ladder of civilization can be unhelpful. Older histories often placed mobile hunting communities at the bottom, farmers somewhere above them, and cities with rulers, writing, and unpleasantly complicated tax systems near the top. The Jomon do not sit neatly on that ladder. Many lived in permanent or semi-permanent settlements, produced elaborate pottery, maintained long-distance exchange, carried out complex rituals, and created large communal spaces without becoming an urban agricultural state. One of the clearest examples is Sanai Maruyama in Aomori. The settlement was occupied for roughly 1,500 years during the Middle Jomon period. Archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of pit house remains, storage pits, graves, refuse areas, roads, and the foundations of substantial buildings. The number and size of dwellings changed over time, showing that the community expanded, reorganized, and declined rather than remaining fixed. Perhaps the most memorable feature is a group of 6 enormous post holes. Each once held a large wooden pillar. Reconstructions often show them supporting a tall platform or tower, although the precise appearance of the original structure remains debated. Whatever stood there required trees of considerable size, careful measurement, coordinated labour, and a plan that extended well beyond one family building a comfortable house for the winter. Wood does not survive like stone. If the pillars and upper structure had remained intact, Sanai Maruyama might be discussed as evidence of monumental wooden architecture. Instead, the timber vanished and left circles in the ground. Archaeology often depends on learning to recognise the shadow of something that is no longer present. A row of stains can be a wall. A dark patch can be a hearth. 6 holes can preserve the outline of a structure that once dominated a settlement. This matters when discussing the possibility of older lost civilizations. If prehistoric Japanese communities built extensively in timber, fibre, bark, and earth, much of their architecture would have disappeared. Japan's climate is not kind to abandoned wooden structures. Rain, insects, fungi, fire, earthquakes, and enthusiastic plant growth can reduce a building to archaeological hints. A civilization does not need to vanish through one dramatic catastrophe. Sometimes ordinary weather is perfectly capable of handling the job. The surviving artifacts show that these communities were connected across considerable distances. Obsidian, jade, shell ornaments, asphalt, amber, and other materials moved between regions. Obsidian was especially valuable because it fractures into extremely sharp edges. Sources on islands and in mountainous areas supplied communities far from the original deposits. Moving such materials required travel routes, social relationships, exchange partners, and probably a reliable understanding of who could be trusted not to disappear after receiving several baskets of carefully prepared chestnuts. Jomon people were capable mariners. The Japanese islands could not have been settled, connected, and supplied without water travel. Dugout canoes have been discovered, and island resources demonstrate crossings that required planning. The boats were made from wood rather than metal, but simplicity of material should not be confused with lack of skill. A canoe must remain stable, carry weight, respond to currents, and return its passengers to land. The ocean is not impressed by archaeological classifications. During the last ice age, sea levels were much lower than today because enormous volumes of water were locked in continental ice sheets. Japan's coastlines extended farther outward, and some islands were connected or separated by narrower channels. As the climate warmed and ice melted, the sea rose, flooding coastal plains where people may once have lived, travelled, gathered food, and built temporary or permanent settlements. This lost coastline is central to the idea that part of Japan's earliest history may now lie underwater. It is entirely reasonable to expect submerged archaeological sites around the archipelago. Similar drowned landscapes exist around the world. That does not automatically mean that cities or stone temples wait beneath every bay, but it does mean that the modern shoreline is a poor guide to where Ice Age people spent their lives. Coastal communities tend to leave evidence near the coast, which is rather inconvenient when the coast later moves several kilometres inland. Camps, fish processing places, boat landings, graves, and settlements may be buried beneath sediment or hidden below water. The oldest surviving inland sites may therefore represent only one part of a much larger human landscape. The warming climate also transformed forests and animal populations. People had to adapt as cold environments retreated and new ecosystems spread. The Jomon period was not born in a stable natural world. Its earliest communities experienced major environmental changes. Their ability to adjust over thousands of years may help explain the long continuity visible in the archaeological record. Genetic studies support a deep history for Jomon ancestry within the archipelago. Ancient genomes suggest links between Jomon populations and people present in Japan during the Upper Paleolithic, although the population history was complex and regional groups were not genetically identical. Later migration from continental East Asia contributed significantly to the ancestry of modern Japanese populations, especially with the spread of yayoi farming and the growth of the Kofun state. The older Jomon ancestry did not simply disappear, but became part of a changing population mixture. The physical remains of Jomon individuals reveal lives that were active and sometimes difficult. Bones can preserve signs of injury, disease, nutrition, repeated movement and physical work. Graves show that the dead were not discarded without concern. Bodies were placed deliberately, sometimes with ornaments or other objects. Cemeteries formed lasting areas within or near settlements, linking communities to ancestors who remained part of the inhabited landscape. Then there are the dog. These small clay figures are among the most recognizable objects from prehistoric Japan. Thousands have been discovered, especially in eastern and northern regions. Some are only a few centimeters tall, others are larger and richly decorated. Many have broad hips, swelling stomachs, marked breasts, elaborate faces, or carefully patterned surfaces. Some appear unmistakably female. Others are difficult to identify. A few seem human at first glance, and then become increasingly strange the longer you look at them. The best known type is the Shakoki dog, produced during the final Jomon period. These figures have enormous eyes that resemble snow goggles, narrow waists, broad shoulders, and bodies covered in complex patterns. Their appearances encourage comparisons with astronauts wearing helmets, gloves, boots, and pressurized suits. In illustrations about ancient visitors, they are often placed beside modern space equipment, where the resemblance becomes difficult to ignore. But resemblance is not the same as historical connection. The large eyes may represent protective eyewear, but they may also be stylized eyelids, spiritual vision, masks, insects, animals, or artistic conventions whose meaning has been lost. Their body patterns might show clothing, tattoos, scarification, jewellery, ritual wrapping, or purely symbolic decoration. Modern observers see spacesuits because spacesuits belong to the catalogue of objects we already know. Imagine an archaeologist several thousand years from now discovering a cartoon mascot. The enormous head, tiny body, white gloves, and fixed smile might inspire several confident theories about the anatomy of 21st century humans. Without films, packaging, or theme parks for context, the explanation could become wonderfully inventive. Dog were not all made in the same style. Earlier examples can be simple and flat, while later forms are often more elaborate. Regional traditions produced heart-shaped faces, horned heads, triangular bodies, seated forms, and figures with carefully modelled limbs. Their variety suggests that they served different roles across different communities and periods, rather than following one universal design. Many dog have been found broken. In some cases, archaeologists believe limbs or other parts may have been deliberately removed. This has led to interpretations involving healing rituals, sympathetic magic, fertility, childbirth, illness, or the transfer of harm from a person into a clay body. A figurine might have represented a human condition, then been broken to remove that condition. It is an appealing explanation, but it cannot be proven for every object. Other possibilities include household spirits, ancestors, ceremonial gifts, teaching objects, protective figures, toys, markers of identity, or representations of beings encountered in ritual experience. The same object might even change meaning during its life. It could begin as a carefully made figure, be used in a ceremony, pass through several hands, and eventually be broken and buried. The temptation to give all dog one purpose may come from our desire for tidy answers. Museums place objects in labelled cases, so we expect each object to have a label that says exactly what it did. Ancient life was probably less cooperative. A modern photograph can be decoration, evidence, memory, propaganda, identification, art, or something kept in a drawer because no one has decided what to do with it. A clay figure could be just as flexible. What Doge clearly demonstrate is that Jomon communities invested time in images that were not directly required for survival. Someone gathered clay, prepared it, shaped a body, added patterns, and controlled the firing. This work required knowledge and attention. The figures belong to a world of shared symbols. People looking at them probably understood details that are invisible to us, just as a modern uniform can communicate profession, rank, nationality, and role to someone familiar with its design. Jomon pottery carries the same complexity. Some vessels were plain and practical. Others were built with dramatic rims, curling projections, flame-like shapes, and dense surface patterns. Middle Jomon flame pots are so elaborate that cooking over them seems almost disrespectful, although residue and wear show that decorative pottery could still have practical uses. Beauty and utility were not necessarily separate categories. The patterns may have referred to snakes, water, fire, plants, faces, or movement. Some archaeologists interpret pottery surfaces as miniature worlds, in which beings and environmental features were represented rather than merely decorated. The exact meanings remain uncertain, but the vessels were clearly more than accidental lumps of fired clay. Lacquerwork adds another surprise. Jomon craftspeople collected sap, refined it, mixed pigments, and applied coatings to wood, pottery, baskets, ornaments, and other objects. Lacquer production requires several controlled steps and a good understanding of material behaviour. Finished pieces could be glossy, waterproof, durable, and brightly coloured. Unfortunately, many lacquered objects were made from organic materials that rarely survive unless burial conditions are unusually favourable. Textiles, baskets, cordage, nets, clothing, wooden containers, houses, boats, and carved objects must once have filled Jomon settlements. Much of this material world has vanished. What we see in museums is not a complete civilization. It is the portion that resisted decay or happened to be preserved in wet ground, shell deposits, burned buildings, or protected soil. This missing organic technology should make us careful in both directions. It warns against describing the Jomon as simple, because many of their finest creations may be gone. It also warns against assuming that unexplained stonework must belong to a highly industrial civilization. Skilled communities can accomplish remarkable things through wood, rope, stone tools, controlled fire, abrasives, and cooperative labour. The absence of metal machinery does not leave people helpless beside a rock. The Jomon also constructed ceremonial landscapes. Stone circles at sites such as Oyu in Akita were assembled from stones carried and arranged in deliberate patterns. Graves, pits, alignments, and associated settlement remains indicate repeated communal activity. These were not enormous in the manner of Daisen Kofun or Baalbek, but they show that building with stone had social and ritual importance long before Japan's historic state monuments appeared. Transporting many stones requires a reason. The builders had to select them, carry them, position them, and maintain the space around them. The work probably reinforced relationships among participants. A stone circle was not only an object at the end of construction, it was also the shared effort of building it. It is possible that later Japanese beliefs preserved distant echoes of older practices. Sacred mountains, unusual rocks, springs, caves, trees, and boundary places remained important throughout Japanese history. Shinto traditions developed in historical settings and should not simply be projected unchanged into the Jomon past, but reverence for powerful places may have very deep roots. Stories can carry fragments of older landscapes without preserving exact historical information. A legend about a submerged land might remember a local flood, a vanished sandbar, or nothing more than the human fear of the sea. A tale of beings descending from the sky might describe gods, ancestors, weather, political authority, or imaginative storytelling rather than visitors in machines. Oral memory can be durable, but it is not a recording device. The idea of a technologically advanced civilization before the end of the Ice Age often places the Jomon near the centre of an older global story. Their early pottery, maritime skill, unusual figurines, submerged coastlines, and long cultural continuity seem to provide several promising clues. Could they have inherited knowledge from people who lived before rising seas? Could dogu represent remembered visitors? Could monumental structures have existed along drowned shores? These questions are not unreasonable to ask, but the answers require evidence stronger than visual resemblance. An advanced Ice Age civilization should leave patterns, specialized tools, large production areas, distinctive waste, transport systems, repeated architecture, modified materials, and datable remains appearing together. So far, the established Jomon record shows complex hunter-gatherer communities with pottery, managed landscapes, settled villages, long-distance exchange, ritual construction, and sophisticated art. That is already remarkable without turning them into survivors of an industrial world. The more interesting possibility may be that our definition of advancement is too narrow. A society can be highly knowledgeable without producing engines, concrete towers, or written laws. Jomon communities survive through climate shifts, earthquakes, volcanic activity, changing coastlines, and regional population changes for millennia. They understood plants, animals, seasons, currents, fire, clay, wood, stone, and social cooperation. A modern visitor transported into their forest would probably become hungry and lost before lunchtime. Their achievement was not the construction of one empire, it was the maintenance of many ways of life across an unstable archipelago for an extraordinary length of time. They created permanent places without turning the entire landscape into farmland. They exchanged materials without a known system of coins. They built ritual worlds without leaving us written instructions. And they shaped clay figures so memorable that thousands of years later, we're still arguing about what their eyes mean. By the end of the Jomon period, new communities were arriving from the continent, bringing wet rice agriculture, metalworking, and different social arrangements. The transition was gradual and varied by region. Jomon traditions continued, mixed with new practices, or lasted longer in areas less affected by early farming. The older world was not switched off one morning and replaced before dinner. People met, traded, competed, intermarried, moved and adapted. Over time, larger political centres formed. New rulers controlled land and labour. Burial mounds grew to enormous proportions. Written records eventually appeared. By then, the people who created the earliest pottery and dogue had become ancestors without names. Their memory may survive indirectly in genes, local customs, settlement locations, ritual habits, and stories attached to unusual places. Yet much remains beneath the ground or below the sea. Every excavation adds detail while creating new questions. A storage pit suggests planning. Imported stone suggests a journey. A broken figurine suggests a ceremony whose words cannot be heard. And behind these small objects waits a much larger physical question. If prehistoric and ancient Japanese communities could organize settlements, travel by sea, trade across regions, and build communal monuments, how far could their engineering abilities extend when they turned toward the mountains themselves? In several parts of Japan, cliffs and hills contain cuts too regular to overlook. Vast chambers have been opened beneath the earth. Stone walls rise where entire sections of mountain were removed block by block. Some of these works belong to documented quarry industries, while others have acquired stories of forgotten builders and unknown purposes. To follow the stone from a Jomon tool held in one hand to landscapes transformed by organised extraction, we must leave the clay figures and coastal villages behind for a while and enter the mountains, where the marks of chisels, wedges, ropes and human persistence still cover the walls. The stone tools left by Japan's earliest communities were small enough to hold in one hand. They were shaped for cutting wood, preparing food, hunting animals, and carrying out the ordinary tasks that allowed people to survive. Thousands of years later, stoneworkers in the same islands would face the same basic material on an entirely different scale. Instead of removing a flake from a rock, they removed blocks from mountains. Instead of leaving a shallow scar, they opened corridors, cliffs, shafts, platforms, and chambers large enough to make the landscape look as though someone had started constructing a city inside it. This change did not happen suddenly. There was no morning when everyone set down a stone arrowhead and decided to hollow out a mountain before lunch. Skills accumulated slowly. People learned how different rocks fractured, how moisture changed them, where natural layers could be exploited, and how wedges could turn a narrow cut into a major break. They learned which stone remained strong in a wall, which resisted fire, which could be carved into detailed shapes, and which became a pile of expensive rubble halfway through transport. Japan's mountains contain many kinds of stone created by volcanic activity, sedimentation, pressure and erosion. Some are hard and stubborn. Others are soft enough to carve when freshly exposed but become more durable after contact with the air. A quarry worker did not need modern geology to recognise these differences. Years of experience could reveal what a stone would do long before a written description explained why. 2 places show the scale that Japanese quarrying eventually reached particularly well. One rises above Tokyo Bay, where entire sections of Mount Nokogiri were cut into vertical walls. The other lies north of Tokyo near Utsunomiya, where the extraction of Oya Stone produced a network of underground spaces so large that visitors sometimes feel they have entered the remains of a buried civilization. At first glance, Mount Nokogiri looks like a natural fortress. It stands on the Boso Peninsula in Chiba Prefecture, facing the waters of Tokyo Bay. Its name means sore mountain, a reference to the jagged outline of its ridge. The mountain is not especially tall by Japanese standards, reaching a little over 300 meters, but it rises steeply enough to dominate the surrounding coast. Walking through it is a strange experience because religious monuments, forest paths, natural cliffs, and abandoned industrial workings overlap. Stone Buddhist figures appear beside old extraction routes. Steps climb through narrow passages. Enormous cut faces rise behind trees. In some places, the walls are so straight that they resemble the sides of buildings rather than the remains of a quarry. This has encouraged comparisons with ancient sites in Peru, Egypt, Turkey, and China. Photographs of the deeper quarry walls are sometimes presented without context, making them appear to be the foundations of an unknown megalithic settlement. A viewer sees rectangular cuts, towering chambers, and dark openings in the rock, and naturally wonders why the site is not described as a ruined city. The answer is that Mount Nokogiri's main quarrying history is not prehistoric. Much of the dramatic cutting visible today was produced from the late Edo period through the modern era. The stone extracted there became known as Boshu stone, a tufaceous sandstone valued because it could be worked relatively easily and resisted fire. It was used for foundations, walls, warehouses, stoves, lanterns, harbour construction, and military works around Tokyo Bay. As Edo became Tokyo and the surrounding region modernised, demand increased, turning the mountain into an important centre of stone production. Knowing this does not make the mountain less impressive. In some ways, it makes it more so. The landscape was transformed by workers whose lives are far less famous than the buildings their stone supported. They did not arrive with computer-guided cutting systems or fleets of heavy trucks. For much of the industry's history, the work depended on hand tools, carts, ropes, timber, prepared routes, and a great deal of physical effort. A quarry began with selection. Stoneworkers studied the exposed rock looking for quality, layers, cracks, and signs of weakness. A block with a hidden fracture could break at the wrong moment, wasting days of labour and possibly injuring anyone standing nearby. Once a suitable section was chosen, workers cut grooves around the intended block. Picks and chisels gradually deepened the separation lines. Wedges could then be driven into prepared openings, applying pressure until the stone detached. The process was repetitive rather than mysterious. A tool struck the same area again and again, each impact removing a small amount. Modern eyes often look at a large cut surface and assume that only a fast machine could have produced it. But a mountain does not care whether it is altered in an afternoon or across several seasons. Small actions become enormous when repeated by many people for years. The quarry faces preserve this repetition. Lines run across the walls where blocks were removed in sequence. Some sections contain deep rectangular recesses. Others show narrow ledges where workers stood. The mountain was not cut according to one single master plan. Quarrying advanced where useful stone could be reached, where transport remained possible, and where the surrounding rock could support continued extraction. Removing a block was only the beginning. A stone resting high on a mountain is not very helpful to a builder beside the sea. The material had to be shaped, lowered, and moved toward boats. At Mount Nokogiri, traces of old transport routes still cross the slopes. One was known as the Shariki-michi, a path used by stone carriers and specialised carts. Another method involved prepared chutes down which stone could be lowered or slid. Some of the blocks weighed more than 200 kilograms. Local accounts describe men cutting the stone while women transported heavy loads using small two-wheeled carts called nekoguruma. The paths still contain marks associated with braking and repeated movement. The image is worth holding for a moment. The walls may look like the product of vanished machinery, yet part of the machinery was human balance, muscle, timing, and familiarity with every turn in the path. The work demanded more than strength. A heavy cart descending a steep mountain could become uncontrollable very quickly. The carrier had to regulate its speed, anticipate changes in the ground, and keep the load balanced. There was little room for distraction. Looking away because a pleasant bird had appeared nearby was probably not encouraged. Once the stone reached the coast, boats provided the most efficient way to move it toward growing centres around Tokyo Bay. Water transport has always been essential to large-scale stone industries. A block that is painfully difficult to drag over land can travel much farther once loaded onto a vessel. Ports, storage areas, merchants, stone dealers, and building contractors formed a network connecting the quarry to distant construction sites. Boshu stone helped support harbours, coastal defences, warehouses, and urban development. It was used in projects around Yokohama and in fortifications such as the sea forts built in Tokyo Bay. The mountain was therefore not an isolated workshop. It was one end of a regional industrial system. That system also explains why large quarries can appear disconnected from the cultures that produced them. The people cutting the stone may live near the mountain, while the finished blocks appear many kilometres away. Tools wear out and are replaced. Temporary wooden structures decay, ropes disappear, carts are dismantled, boats are lost or rebuilt. Eventually, the durable parts of the industry are the empty spaces and the stone structures built elsewhere. If all written records vanished, a future archaeologist might find the cut mountain and struggle to identify its purpose. The missing blocks would be scattered across cities, incorporated into walls whose original sources had been forgotten. The quarry would resemble a monument without a building, an enormous work defined mainly by what had been taken away. Mount Nokogiri's stone industry eventually declined. New materials, particularly concrete, changed construction. Transport methods shifted. Cheaper or more suitable stone became available from other regions. The remaining quarry activity ended during the 20th century. Forest returned to abandoned working areas, softening their appearance without hiding their geometry completely. The result is a landscape that feels far older than much of its cutting actually is. Moss grows over steps, tree roots enter cracks, rain darkens the walls. A path once filled with workers becomes quiet enough for visitors to hear the wind moving through leaves. Industrial remains have become ruins, and ruins are very good at borrowing extra centuries from the imagination. There is also an important overlap between quarrying and religion on the mountain. Nihonji, the temple complex spread across Mount Nokogiri, includes large Buddhist carvings and hundreds of stone figures. The relationship between sacred space and stone industry was not necessarily contradictory. Mountains could be places of worship and material extraction at the same time. A worker might pray for safety before helping remove part of the landscape. This combination makes the mountain difficult to classify with one simple description. It is a geological formation, a religious landscape, an industrial site, a transport system, and now a place of tourism. Each period has left marks on top of the previous one. What looks ancient may be modern. What appears natural may have been shaped by quarrying. What seems industrial may have acquired religious meaning. The Oya quarries near Utsunomiya take this confusion even farther, because much of the extraction happened underground. Oya stone formed from volcanic material deposited roughly 20 million years ago. It is a type of tuff created from compressed volcanic ash and related debris. The deposit covers a limited area, giving the region a stone with distinctive colour, texture and working properties. It was light compared with many other building stones, relatively easy to carve, and useful in structures requiring resistance to fire. At the surface, Oya is already unusual. Cliffs and exposed formations rise around the district in shapes that invite stories. Temples, carvings, houses, storehouses, walls and monuments use the local stone, so the material seems to emerge from the landscape and continue directly into human architecture. Quarrying for building material began during the Edo period. Early extraction could be carried out by farmers when other work allowed, but by the Meiji period the industry expanded substantially. Roads, handcar railways, conventional railways, and improved transport allowed more stone to reach Utsunomiya, Tokyo, Yokohama and other markets. What began as a local material became part of Japan's modern urban development. The underground quarry, now preserved as the Oya History Museum, was worked between 1919 and 1986. It covers roughly 20,000 square metres and descends around 30 metres below ground. Yet this museum is only one part of a much larger regional story. At the height of the industry, hundreds of quarry sites operated around Oya, many of them underground. Descending into the museum, a visitor moves from ordinary daylight into cool, dim air. The temperature remains low throughout the year. Stairs lead into spaces that widen unexpectedly. Walls rise far overhead. Massive stone pillars divide the chambers, left in place to support the ceiling. Artificial lights reveal one section while allowing the next to fade into darkness. It does not feel like a hole dug to obtain building material. It feels planned, almost ceremonial. The proportions suggest halls, processional routes and hidden rooms. Music concerts, art installations and film productions have used the chambers precisely because they possess an atmosphere that ordinary architecture struggles to produce. Yet the atmosphere is a side effect. The chambers exist because blocks were removed in an organised pattern while enough stone remained to prevent collapse. Their apparent architecture is the negative shape of an industry. The walls are what remained after the valuable material departed. Before mechanisation, quarry workers used picks to separate standard blocks. One local account states that a worker might swing a pick roughly 4,000 times to extract a single piece. Even allowing for variation between stone, worker and period, the number gives a sense of the repetition involved. The work demanded accuracy because each cut needed to help release a usable block rather than simply damage the surrounding rock. Hand-cut walls show dense diagonal or horizontal marks. Later mechanised surfaces appear different, preserving long regular lines made by cutting equipment. This allows visitors to read technology directly from the stone. One wall records human rhythm, another records a machine's steady path. Chainsaw-style quarrying machines entered use around the late 1950s and early 1960s. As mechanisation spread, production rose dramatically. Research on the regional industry records an increase from around 240,000 tonnes in 1955 to roughly 890,000 tonnes by 1973. Machines increased speed, but they did not remove the need for planning. Underground quarrying had to account for roof stability, pillar spacing, access, ventilation, drainage, lighting and transport. Cutting too aggressively could weaken the entire chamber. Every empty space changed the stresses in the stone around it. The regular pillars are therefore not evidence that the quarry began as a temple. They are evidence that the workers understood how to remove material without bringing the mountain down onto themselves. Practical engineering often creates beautiful forms because balance, symmetry and repetition are efficient. Transport changed alongside extraction. Handcarts and narrow rail systems moved blocks from quarry sites. Later roads and railways carried increasing quantities toward urban markets. The routes eventually influenced the shape of local streets. Stone dealers, warehouses, workshops, and buildings line these corridors, creating a townscape formed by the industry. Oya stone was used in ordinary storehouses, walls, houses, churches, public buildings, and decorative work. Its most internationally famous use may be the former Imperial Hotel designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, where the stone's texture allowed extensive carving. The original hotel was later demolished, apart from a reconstructed central section, but its design demonstrated how a local quarry product could become part of a highly visible modern building. The stone was also valued for storehouses because of its fire resistance and ability to help regulate interior conditions. In cities where wooden buildings stood close together, fire was an ever-present danger. A stone warehouse offered protection for goods that merchants preferred not to watch disappear in one energetic evening. The underground spaces had uses beyond quarrying. During the Second World War, parts of the Oya workings were used for military production. Afterwards, some chambers stored rice. Their stable cool temperatures made them useful for storage, while their size allowed activities that could remain hidden from the surface. These later uses complicate the archaeological record. Imagine encountering the site without documents. Ammunition-related remains might suggest a military installation. Storage fixtures could indicate an underground granary. Tool marks reveal quarrying. Religious objects elsewhere in the district suggest sacred activity. Several correct explanations can occupy the same space at different times. This is often what happens at ancient sites. Modern visitors search for one original purpose, but a useful place rarely remains dedicated to only one task. A cave can become a shelter, a shrine, a tomb, a storehouse, and a tourist attraction. The layers are not evidence that historians are confused. They are evidence that people reuse good spaces. The scale of Oya has inevitably attracted alternative interpretations. Some visitors wonder whether the visible quarries expanded pre-existing chambers. Others suggest that the oldest parts could belong to a forgotten civilization. The walls appear too high, the pillars too regular, and the underground network too extensive to feel like the result of ordinary quarrying. There is no established evidence that the chambers predate the documented stone industry. The tool marks, transport history, production records, local buildings, and changes from hand-cutting to mechanized extraction create a clear explanation for much of the landscape. The mystery comes not from the absence of a known industry, but from the difficulty of emotionally accepting what that industry achieved. A pick is small. A chamber is enormous. The mind struggles to connect them. The same difficulty appears at many ancient monuments. We see a finished pyramid, but not the millions of individual movements that created it. We see a stone wall, but not the workers preparing ropes, repairing sledges, clearing roads, sharpening tools, cooking meals, carrying water, and arguing about whose turn it was to move the particularly unpleasant block near the corner. Large construction becomes less impossible when it is divided into repeated tasks. This does not mean every old structure is fully explained. It means scale alone cannot tell us whether lost technology was required. Mount Nokogiri and Oya also demonstrate how industries can vanish while their physical achievements remain. Quarrying once shaped local economies. Families depended on it. Roads and ports served it. Special skills passed from experienced workers to younger ones. Then materials changed, markets declined, and extraction slowed. A few generations later, the empty workings feel detached from everyday life. The knowledge has not vanished completely, but it no longer surrounds the site in the way it once did. A visitor sees silent walls where workers would have heard striking tools, carts, machinery, instructions, and warnings. This may be what is meant by Japan's lost stone industry. The quarry sites themselves are not unknown, and much of their history can be documented. What has faded is the living system that made them understandable. Remove the sound, labour, transport, and commercial demand, and the mountain begins to resemble a puzzle. These quarries give us a useful standard for judging more mysterious stonework. They show what hand tools can accomplish. They show how rapidly mechanization changes production. They show that mountains can be transformed without an advanced prehistoric civilization. They also show that written records and visible evidence can still leave important questions about methods, working lives, and earlier phases of activity. Most importantly, they teach us to examine tool marks, geology, transport, and context before deciding that a surface is impossible. A A clean angle may follow a natural layer. A vast chamber may be the product of blocks removed one at a time. An apparent temple may be an abandoned industrial void. But not every Japanese stone site provides such a complete chain of evidence. Some contain no huge network of transport routes, no surviving business records, and no long sequence of clearly identifiable quarry marks. Instead, they appear as single enormous objects cut into forms whose purposes remain uncertain. One looks as though a gigantic stone vessel has been left on a hillside. Another seems to float above a pool. A broad slab carries channels and circular basins arranged like part of a system whose missing pieces have never been found. These monuments are smaller than a mountain quarry, yet their isolation makes them more difficult to explain, because removing stone is one question, while deciding why it was shaped into a very specific and unfinished form is another. The empty quarries of Mount Nokogiri and Oya show what happens when stone is removed for a clear practical reason. Blocks are cut, transported, sold, and placed into buildings. Tool marks can be compared with known equipment. Roads and documents connect the mountain to the structures that received its stone. Even when the chambers appear mysterious, the industry behind them remains visible. Japan's isolated monoliths are more difficult to read. They were not carved simply to obtain useful blocks, because the blocks themselves were left behind. Their builders shaped enormous masses of stone into forms that appear intentional, then either stopped before completing them, or completed something whose purpose no longer makes sense to us. There are no instruction plaques left by the original workers, no surviving contracts, and no helpful supervisor waiting nearby to explain why everyone spent several years carving a rock that now resembles part of an oversized machine. One of the strangest stands in Takasago in Hyogo Prefecture. It is known as Ishi-no-Hoden, the stone treasure hall, and it rests within the grounds of Oshiko Shrine. The object is carved from the local stone and remains surrounded on several sides by the bedrock from which it was separated. Each of its main dimensions exceeds 5 meters, and a large projection extends from its rear. Its form has no clear parallel elsewhere in Japan. Water collects around its base, while the narrow support beneath it is difficult to see from an ordinary viewing position, creating the famous impression that the entire mass is floating. A visitor approaching it does not see a rough boulder with a few decorative cuts. The stone has broad faces, clear edges, and a deliberate geometric profile. One section resembles a huge rectangular body. Another projects outward like the sloping end of a roof, a handle, or the unfinished attachment point of something no longer present. A narrow path allows people to pass around the sides, making it possible to see how thoroughly the surrounding bedrock was cut away. The floating appearance gives the stone much of its power. Water hides the central support and reflects the lower surface. From the right angle, the block seems to rest without fully touching the ground, which would be a worrying design choice for an ordinary building and a very effective one for a sacred object. The stone is not merely an archaeological curiosity placed inside a shrine after its discovery. It is the sacred body of the site. Its mystery and religious importance have grown together over centuries. Local tradition connects it with divine builders who attempted to construct a stone palace in a single night. Their work was interrupted, leaving the monument incomplete, although the deities remained to protect the land. Stories of overnight construction appear around many ancient monuments. A task seems too large for ordinary people, so it is assigned to gods, giants, spirits, or supernatural workers with excellent speed and rather unreliable schedules. The legend does not tell us who physically carved Ishi-no-Hoden, but it preserves an old recognition that the object was unusual even to people who lived much closer to its creation. The monument was already ancient enough to attract explanation when it appeared in the Haruma provincial record compiled during the early 8th century. That source described a great stone shaped like a house. Its presence in such an early text proves that Ishi-no-Hoden has stood in recognizable form for at least 13 centuries, but the text does not settle when the carving began or what its builders intended. One interpretation connects it with the Kofun period and the production of enormous stone burial containers. The surrounding Tatsuyama district supplied stone for sarcophagi, foundations, religious sculpture, castle walls, and later government buildings. Quarrying in the area continued for roughly 1700 years, leaving a long record of specialised stoneworking. Ishi-no-Hoden therefore did not appear in a region unfamiliar with the large stone. It stood inside one of Japan's most important quarry landscapes. A proposed explanation is that it was intended as a stone burial chamber or sarcophagus component for a powerful ruler. The large projection at the rear may be understood as part of a design that would have made more sense after the stone was separated, turned, moved, or placed within an earthen tomb. If work stopped before those stages, the object we see today may be an unfinished piece rather than a finished monument. That possibility is easy to overlook because the stone has been treated as sacred for so long. Once a failed project becomes a shrine object, it no longer looks failed. Water, ritual, buildings, legends, and generations of visitors give it a sense of completion that the original workers may never have intended. Yet the unfinished sarcophagus theory creates its own difficulties. The block is enormous. Separating it completely would have required further cutting beneath the mass. Moving it would have demanded a prepared route, timber, ropes, levers, labour, and a destination capable of receiving it. None of that was impossible for Kofun period builders who transported massive stones for tombs, but it would have been an exceptional project. A crack, a political death, a change of ruler, or a flaw discovered in the material could have ended the work. Ancient construction depended heavily on patrons. When the person paying for a monument died or lost power, enthusiasm among the workforce could decline with remarkable speed. A ruler may have wanted a unique tomb until a successor decided that a conventional one would be quite sufficient. Alternative interpretations take the stone much farther back in time. Its shape has been compared with a machine housing, a counterweight, a power device, and an architectural component inherited from a forgotten civilization. The water around it is sometimes treated as evidence that the monument once used hydraulic or electrical principles. The problem is that shape alone cannot reveal function. Modern machinery has trained us to interpret geometric objects as devices. A rectangular projection looks as if it should connect with another component, because that is how manufactured equipment works in our own world. Ancient designers, however, also used geometry for tombs, platforms, shrines, pillars, and symbolic monuments. Water adds atmosphere, but it does not automatically indicate advanced technology. Springs and pools are common around sacred sites. Water may have been present naturally, managed deliberately, or incorporated after the carving acquired religious importance. A pool can be part of a machine, but it can also be part of a shrine, a drainage problem, or an especially determined collection of rain. The most honest answer is that Ishi-no-Hoden is clearly artificial, clearly old, and still not securely explained. Its setting makes a late prehistoric or early historical origin more plausible than an Ice Age one. But even that broad placement does not identify its patron or settle whether it was meant to move. The builders left a large amount of stone and a very small amount of certainty. Several hours away, the landscape of Asuka presents a different kind of mystery. Here the stones are connected with the period when an emerging Japanese state was building palaces, temples, government facilities, gardens, workshops, and royal tombs. During the 6th and 7th centuries, rulers based in the region adopted and adapted ideas arriving through the Korean peninsula and China. Buddhism, writing, new architectural forms, metalworking knowledge, surveying methods, and systems of government were reshaping the country. Stone was part of that transformation. Asuka contains carved fountains, tomb chambers, foundation stones, animal forms, human figures, and objects that no longer fit comfortably into any single category. The area is sometimes described as a city of stone, although much of the architecture above ground would have been timber. On a wooded hill northeast of the ancient palace area lies Sakafune-ishi. Its name is usually translated as the Sake Ship Stone. The surviving object is a large flattened stone carved with circular depressions, shallow basins and narrow channels that branch across its upper surface. The name encouraged the idea that it was used to prepare sake. Grain or liquid might have been placed in the depressions and guided through the grooves. Other proposals suggested medicine, oil, dye, or the processing of plants. From above, the design resembles a practical system. Something appears intended to move from one basin to another. The difficulty is that the stone has been damaged. Parts of it were removed in later periods, so the complete original pattern is unknown. A system that now appears incomplete may only look that way because sections no longer survive. Trying to understand it is a little like discovering half a kitchen appliance and concluding that the manufacturer had a very unusual attitude towards soup. For many years, Sakafune-ishi could be discussed almost in isolation. Archaeological discoveries around the hill changed that. Excavations revealed stone walls, paved areas, a spring facility, stair-like structures, and carved basins at the foot of the slope. Water was brought from underground, passed through a boat-shaped stone feature, and flowed into a carefully carved turtle-shaped basin. The scale and arrangement of the remains have led researchers to interpret the area as an important ritual complex associated with rulers and state formation during the middle of the 7th century. This context makes ceremonial water a stronger explanation than sake production. The hilltop stone may have formed part of a larger sequence involving purification, offerings, divination, or rituals performed by the court. Water emerging from the earth could be collected, directed, displayed, and used in ceremonies whose political and religious meanings were closely connected. In early states, ritual was not separate from government in the modern sense. A ruler's authority could depend on communicating with deities, maintaining seasonal order, honouring ancestors, and performing ceremonies correctly. A channel cut into stone might therefore serve both a practical and a political purpose. The water moved physically, while the ritual demonstrated that the ruler could manage relationships between the human community and the sacred world. The turtle-shaped basin found below the hill adds another curious feature. Water flowed into the carved animal through its mouth or head area and collected in a central hollow. With a stopper in place, the basin could hold roughly 200 litres. The facility was carefully arranged within a broad stone-paved space, suggesting that people gathered or performed formal actions around it. Exactly what happened there is not recorded. The turtle form may have carried meanings connected with water, longevity, direction, stability, or cosmology. Those associations are familiar from later East Asian traditions, but applying them too neatly to one ancient object can be risky. The basin may not even represent a turtle in precisely the way modern viewers assume. Ancient animals have an unfortunate habit of refusing to identify themselves after several centuries of erosion. Sakafune-ishi therefore shows how archaeology can reduce one mystery while preserving another. Excavation gives us a date, a larger site, and strong evidence for controlled water. It weakens the idea that the grooves belong to an isolated prehistoric machine. Yet the exact ceremony, the participants, and the meaning of the design remain unknown. Not far away rests another animal-shaped object, Kame-ishi, the turtle stone. Unlike the carefully hollowed basin at Sakafune-ishi, Kame-ishi is a broad granite boulder with a face carved into one side. Its rounded body and low position make it resemble a turtle settled onto the ground. The stone measures roughly 3.5 meters in length, a little over 2 meters in width, and nearly 2 meters in height. Its original date and function remain uncertain. Suggestions include a boundary marker, a religious object, or part of a larger monument that has disappeared. Its expression is strangely calm. The eyes are simple. The mouth curves slightly. It looks less like a terrifying guardian than an ancient animal waiting for everyone else to finish arguing. Yet the local legend attached to it is not especially reassuring. According to one version, The stone once faced east and now faces south. If it ever turns fully toward the west, the land of Japan will be covered in mud. No one appears overly concerned that the stone will begin rotating on an ordinary afternoon. Still, the legend gives direction a clear importance. East, south and west are not interchangeable. The turtle's orientation is connected with the condition of the land, and its final movement would signal disaster. Such stories can preserve memories of boundaries, floods, political divisions or sacred geography, although they can also develop much later around an object whose purpose was already forgotten. Once a stone looks like an animal, stories about its behaviour become almost unavoidable. A carved turtle that remains completely still for 14 centuries may be archaeologically useful, but it is not much of a character until someone gives it the power to destroy the countryside. One theory connects Kame-ishi with the boundary of Kawahara-dera, an important temple established during the Asuka period. The stone may have marked the edge of temple land or belonged to a decorative arrangement. If so, later changes to roads, fields and buildings removed the context that once made its placement obvious. A boundary marker does not need an inscription if everyone in the local community knows what it means. The problem begins when the community changes. A stone that once communicated ownership or sacred limits becomes a puzzling animal in a field. The information was carried in people rather than in the object, and people are considerably less durable than granite. Some alternative theories link Kame-ishi with a network of prehistoric monuments, or suggest that it originally formed part of a machine-like system involving other Asuka stones. Yet no physical connection has been demonstrated between it and Ishi-no-Hoden, Sakafune-ishi, or the monuments scattered elsewhere in Japan. The similarities are real only at a broad level. They are large stones. They were shaped deliberately. Their complete functions are uncertain. Beyond that, the materials, locations, dates and forms differ. Grouping them together can be useful for exploring ancient stoneworking, but it can also create the impression of one hidden system where several unrelated histories may exist. The most imposing of Asuka's isolated stones is found on a hill in modern Kashihara. Masuda-no-Iwafune, the rockship of Masuda, appears after a short climb through trees. It is not a separate block carried to the summit. It was carved from a huge mass of granite already present on the hill. The object measures approximately 11 metres from east to west, 8 metres from north to south, and close to 5 metres in height. Estimates place its weight at around 800 tons. Its upper surface has been flattened, and a shallow central groove contains 2 square openings, each roughly 1.5 metres across and more than a metre deep. Photographs often make it look smaller than it is because the surrounding trees provide no familiar scale. A person standing beside it barely reaches the lower part of the carved face. The upper surface cannot be inspected casually from the ground. Even the name rockship encourages the eye to see a vessel resting on the hillside, although it is unlikely to perform especially well if launched. The stone's geometry is striking. One end has a raised ridge. Vertical and sloping faces show areas of deliberate shaping. The 2 square pits above appear to demand a practical explanation. They look as though posts, containers, fittings, or paired objects once belonged inside them. An astronomical theory proposes that the flat upper surface and alignment could have supported observations of the sun or stars. The object might have served as a platform, a marker, or the base for another structure. A religious interpretation sees it as an altar. An old tradition connects it with a stone monument supposedly intended to celebrate the construction of nearby Masuda Pond. The interpretation most widely favoured by local archaeological authorities is less exotic but still remarkable. Masuda-no-Iwafune may be an unfinished stone burial container, specifically a type of side-opening sarcophagus or chamber associated with elite tomb construction. A crack or defect in the granite may have caused the project to be abandoned before the object was fully separated and completed. Other unfinished or displaced stone tomb components around Asuka help support this possibility. The region contains monuments known as the Devil's Cutting Board and Devil's Toilet, which are generally understood as parts of a stone burial chamber separated after a tomb collapsed or was dismantled. Their colourful names were added by later communities who no longer recognised them as engineering components. If Masuda-no-Iwafune was intended for a tomb, the two pits may represent the early stages of hollowing or structural features required by the final design. The block's current orientation might not match the position it was supposed to occupy after extraction. What appears to be the top today could have become a side, base, or internal face. This is an important point whenever an unfinished object is interpreted. We naturally assume that it was meant to remain upright exactly as we see it. Quarry workers may have planned to rotate it. An object that looks like a platform in its abandoned position might have become a chamber wall once moved. This size still raises a sensible question. Why begin with such an enormous mass? Elite tombs were statements of authority. Their construction displayed access to labour, stone, land, and specialised knowledge. A burial chamber did not merely protect a body. It announced that the individual inside commanded resources even after death. There was little advantage in being modest if the purpose of the monument was to ensure that no one forgot who had been important. A massive granite sarcophagus or chamber could have been intended for a ruler or powerful member of the court during a period when burial architecture was changing rapidly. The project may have pushed the material beyond what was practical. If a serious crack appeared, the workers faced a simple but unpleasant reality. Granite does not accept apologies, and several 100 tons of damaged stone cannot be returned to the supplier. The abandoned block then remained on the hill. Soil accumulated around its lower portion. Trees grew. The tomb for which it may have been intended was built differently or somewhere else. The unfinished component became more durable than the political circumstances that created it. This explanation requires no unknown machine. Granite can be shaped with iron tools, hammer stones, repeated chiselling, fire, wedges, and abrasives. The work would have been slow, but slow work is common in societies capable of organising skilled labour over long periods. Still, saying that the stone could be carved does not mean we fully understand how the project was managed. Archaeologists can propose tools and sequences, yet many practical details remain uncertain. How many workers were involved? How was waste removed from the hill? What wooden structures surrounded the block? How was the intended transport route prepared? Was the monument abandoned early or only after years of effort? These are genuine mysteries, even if the lost civilization theory is not accepted. Traditional engineering methods do not make the work ordinary. They make the human commitment behind it more visible. The 4 monuments also reveal different kinds of uncertainty. Ishi-no-Hoden is ancient, sacred, and connected with a major quarry landscape, but its intended final form is unknown. Sakafune-ishi has gained a stronger ritual context through excavation, yet the exact activity performed around its channels remains lost. Kame-ishi is recognisably carved but almost completely detached from its original setting. Masuda-no-Iwafune looks like an unfinished engineering project, though its destination and patron cannot be identified. None provide secure evidence for a technologically advanced civilization before the end of the Ice Age. Their probable connections lead instead toward the Kofun and Asuka periods, when Japan was developing powerful rulers, monumental tombs, international contacts, and increasingly organised systems of labour. But they do show how easily stone can outlive explanation. Builders may assume that everyone understands their project. Several generations later, the reason is forgotten. Centuries after that, a legend arrives. Eventually, modern investigators measure the stone, compare tool marks, and construct theories from whatever context survives. The monuments then seem impossible not because no one could have carved them, but because we cannot recover the chain of decisions that made carving them worthwhile. That chain becomes slightly easier to follow when we leave unfinished objects and examine structures whose purpose is clearer. Across the Asuka region and far beyond it, ancient builders assembled enormous stones to create chambers for the dead. Earth was piled around them. Moats were dug. Hills were reshaped. Entire landscapes became monuments to rulers whose bodies occupied only a tiny space at the centre. The isolated monoliths show the preparation, carving and abandonment of stone. The great tombs show what happened when projects were completed, when thousands of workers did not stop at one block, but continued until a burial mound was large enough to be seen from the sky. The unfinished monoliths of Asuka leave us wondering what their builders intended to create. The great burial mounds answer part of that question. They show what ancient Japanese engineers could accomplish when a project continued beyond the first carved block. When roads were prepared, labour was gathered, earth was moved, stones were placed, moats were dug, and an entire landscape was reorganised around the burial of one powerful person. A tomb usually begins with something very small: a body, a coffin, a few personal possessions, and a place chosen by the living. Yet in Kofun period Japan, that small centre could become surrounded by a monument hundreds of metres long. Hills were reshaped or built from the ground upward. Terraces were covered with stones. Clay cylinders and figures stood in ordered rows. Smaller tombs appeared around larger ones. Water separated the sacred mound from the ordinary land outside. From a modern street, some of these places look like wooded parks. Their slopes are covered with trees. Birds move across the moats, and the person buried inside is almost impossible to imagine. From the air, the arrangement becomes clear. What seemed to be a natural hill is a precisely shaped monument, with a circular rear section joined to a broad rectangular front. Because this outline resembles the opening of an old-fashioned keyhole, it is usually called keyhole-shaped in English. The name is convenient, although the builders were not thinking about keys. The original Japanese term describes a square front joined to a round rear. The circular section usually contained the primary burial, while the rectangular section may have been used for ceremonies, processions, displays of offerings, or activities connected with the deceased. The exact use varied through time, but the form became one of the clearest signs of elite power in the Japanese archipelago. The period takes its name from these mounds. Kofun simply means old tomb, but the word now refers to a broad age stretching from around the middle of the 3rd century into the 6th century, with some burial traditions continuing later. More than 160,000 kofun of different shapes and sizes are known across Japan. Most are not giant keyholes. They include round mounds, square mounds, scallop-shaped forms, small family tombs, and chambers cut or assembled from stone. Only a small number reach the scale associated with kings and the highest-ranking families. The 49 tombs selected for the UNESCO-listed Mozu Kofun Group represent some of the richest surviving evidence for the society, hierarchy, and funerary practices of this period. The distribution of the mounds tells a political story even before anything inside them is examined. The largest examples cluster around regions that became centres of early state power. Smaller versions appear farther away, often built by local rulers who may have been allied with, subordinate to, or competing against the leading dynasties. The shape of a tomb could communicate status. Its size could reveal access to labour. The objects placed within it could show military authority, trade relationships, and contact with the Korean peninsula and China. This was a world in which political power had not yet been explained through long official histories written by the people building the earliest giant mounds. Archaeologists must therefore reconstruct it through earthworks, pottery, weapons, mirrors, jewellery, horse equipment, human remains, and the changing forms of the tombs themselves. Before reaching the largest burial complexes near Osaka, it helps to stand inside a smaller monument that allows us to see the stones normally hidden under the mound. Ishibutai Kofun lies in Asuka, not far from the carved stones and former palace landscapes we have already visited. Today, its enormous granite chamber is exposed to the open air. Large blocks form the walls and roof, while a passage leads into a space tall enough for visitors to stand beneath the ceiling stones. The name Ishibutai means stone stage. From outside, the broad roof blocks do resemble a platform, as if performances were once held on top. That appearance is misleading. The visible stones were originally buried beneath an earthen mound. What now looks like a freestanding megalithic structure was the internal skeleton of a tomb. More than 30 large stones were used, with their combined weight estimated at roughly 2,300 tons. The largest ceiling block is usually estimated at around 77 tons. The chamber belongs among the largest horizontal entry stone burial spaces in Japan. Its exact occupant remains unconfirmed, although it is commonly associated with Soga no Umako, a powerful political leader who died in the early 7th century. Entering Ishibutai changes the problem from numbers into weight. The walls are not made from tidy bricks. Each stone has an uneven natural outline, and the builders had to choose blocks that could work together. Smaller stones filled gaps. The large roof slabs had to be raised high enough to rest across the chamber, without crushing or shifting the supporting walls. No single movement created the tomb. The project was a sequence. Workers first selected a site and prepared the mound area. Granite had to be obtained from the surrounding region. Blocks were separated from their sources and transported across uneven ground. The builders probably used wooden sledges, rollers where useful, ropes, levers, earthen ramps, and carefully organised teams. The chamber walls could be assembled while earth was packed around them. A roof block did not necessarily need to be lifted vertically into the air by a crane. It could be dragged along a ramp that rose gradually as the walls and surrounding mound grew. Once the stone reached the required position, material beneath and around it could be adjusted until the block settled onto its supports. This method required no mysterious engine, but it did require accurate planning. A ramp that was too steep would make movement harder. Ropes could fail, timber could split, rain could soften the earth, a block might rotate unexpectedly or become lodged in the wrong position. Ancient engineering involved risk, and a 70-ton stone is not especially interested in giving anyone a second attempt. The source of the stone also mattered. A block had to be strong enough to support weight without containing a serious hidden fracture. Workers who quarried and shaped stone repeatedly would learn to read colour, grain, sound, and natural cracks. Striking the surface could reveal differences within it. Experience provided information that modern observers sometimes assume would require advanced instruments. Once the chamber was complete, the deceased could be carried through the passage and placed inside. A stone or wooden coffin may have occupied the main room, accompanied by objects appropriate to rank. The entrance could then be closed, while the mound above and around it made the internal structure disappear. This final appearance is important. Ishibutai was not designed to show its larger stones. They were structural parts hidden beneath the earth. The people standing outside would have seen a broad mound, probably carefully shaped and maintained. The dramatic chamber that now attracts visitors was private, dark, and inaccessible after burial. The loss of the earthen covering has created a false impression of original design. It is as though the walls of a modern building vanished, leaving only pipes and steel supports. Future observers might decide that the exposed framework was intended as a monument, when it had actually been concealed from the beginning. The missing mound has also encouraged stories about deliberate punishment. One tradition suggests that the covering was removed after the downfall of the Soga clan, exposing the tomb of a once powerful man as an insult. Another possibility is simpler erosion, farming, reuse of earth, or gradual damage. The exact process is uncertain. Whoever occupied Ishibutai belonged to a society capable of coordinating specialized work on a large scale. Yet even this impressive tomb is modest beside the vast mounds that rose around the Osaka plain during the height of Kofun construction. The Mozu Group lies within modern Sakai, surrounded today by roads, houses, railway lines, schools, parks, and commercial districts. The Furuichi Group lies farther east, around Habikino and Fujidera. During the 4th, 5th and 6th centuries, these areas became major burial landscapes for the ruling elite. The position was not chosen randomly. The mound stood near important routes connecting inland political centres with Osaka Bay and the wider maritime networks beyond it. Ships approaching the old coastline could see the larger monuments. Travellers moving along rivers and roads would pass through a landscape dominated by royal tombs. This visibility helped the mounds function as more than graves. A gigantic kofun announced that a powerful lineage controlled people, land, food, stone, timber, clay production, and transport. The tomb continued making that announcement after the ruler died. Building one required a broad supply system. Thousands of workers needed food, shelter, tools, and supervision. Earth had to be dug from moats, nearby pits, and construction areas, then carried in baskets or moved with simple equipment. Different types of soil could be selected for stability and drainage. Layers had to be compacted so that the mound did not simply slump into a broad and expensive puddle after the first season of heavy rain. The builders were not piling loose earth without control. Large kofun have terraces, changing slopes, carefully defined outlines, and surfaces protected by stone. Fukiishi, or covering stones, were spread across parts of the mound. These helped to reduce erosion and gave the monument a bright, ordered appearance before vegetation took over. The trees now covering many tombs were not necessarily part of the original design. A completed mound may have looked more like a huge stepped structure of earth and stone lined with clay objects. The quiet, forested islands seen today are the result of centuries of plant growth and restricted access. Rows of haniwa stood along terraces and edges. Early haniwa often took the form of large hollow cylinders. Later examples represented houses, shields, weapons, animals, birds, horses, and people. Some show musicians, attendants, warriors, farmers, or figures participating in ceremonies. The cylinders may have marked boundaries and helped organise sacred space. Figurative haniwa could display scenes connected with the ruler's authority, household, military power, or funeral ritual. They were produced in large numbers, which meant clay had to be collected, shaped, dried, fired, transported, and installed. A huge mound was therefore surrounded by an entire manufacturing industry. The tomb was not a single object. It was a managed complex. Large mounds often had one or more moats. These created physical distance, controlled access, supplied earth for construction, and increased the monument's visual impact. Smaller satellite tombs stood nearby. Some contained relatives, retainers, or people connected with the main burial. Others seem to have held weapons, armour, tools, or ceremonial goods without a human body. The arrangement resembled a political court translated into earth. A dominant mound occupied the centre, while lesser tombs surrounded it according to status and relationship. Even in death, hierarchy remained carefully organised. Many of the smaller mounds have been lost. Urban growth, road construction, farming, and rebuilding after the Second World War destroyed or reduced numerous kofun. Some were excavated quickly before demolition, others disappeared with little investigation. The surviving group is therefore only part of the original cemetery. Sakai City's archaeological record preserves examples of tombs removed during development, while public campaigns saved others. Ishibutai Kofun, for example, faced destruction for housing in the 1950s before a citizen-led preservation effort helped protect it. The struggle changed attitudes towards safeguarding archaeological sites in Japan. This loss should make us cautious when looking at the present map. Spaces between surviving mounds may once have contained roads, workshops, temporary settlements, ritual areas, bridges, and smaller tombs. A modern neighbourhood can hide the pattern that originally connected the monuments. At the centre of the Mozu landscape stands Daisen Kofun, also known as Daisen Ryo or Nintoku Tenno Ryo. It is the largest keyhole-shaped burial mound in Japan. The central mound extends about 486 metres from end to end and was built around the middle of the 5th century. the Imperial Household Agency identifies it as the mausoleum of Emperor Nintoku, while archaeologists continue to use names that acknowledge both the traditional attribution and the physical site. The mound is surrounded by 3 moats and covers an immense area. The Imperial Household Agency gives the protected mausoleum area as roughly 464,000 square meters. From the ground, the scale is difficult to understand because visitors cannot stand at one end and see the complete outline. Trees, water, embankments, and urban buildings break the view. From above, the complete keyhole shape appears immediately. Scale comparisons often place Daisen beside the Great Pyramid of Giza and the mausoleum complex of the first Qin Emperor. These comparisons depend on whether one measures footprint, central mound volume, total protected area, or the surrounding complex, so they should not be treated as a simple contest. Still, they show that the monument belongs among the largest burial constructions of the ancient world. The central mound alone contains an enormous volume of compacted material. Sakai City's comparisons estimate about 1,400,000 cubic meters for the main portion above the water. The Great Pyramid contains more stone by volume, but Daisen spreads across a much broader landscape. It is easy to hear those figures and imagine an army of workers being forced to carry earth under constant supervision. Some labour may certainly have been compulsory or owed as a duty to rulers, yet construction probably involved many different arrangements. Regional communities could provide labour, supplies, specialists, and materials as part of political obligations. Skilled supervisors would organise surveying, drainage, slope angles, haniwa placement, stone covering, transport, and ceremonial structures. Estimating the workforce is difficult because the construction schedule is unknown. A smaller number working over many years can move the same amount as a huge force working quickly. Seasonal labour may have been used when farming demands were lower. Some workers may have been permanent specialists, while others arrived temporarily from communities linked to the ruling centre. Food supply was as important as digging. A workforce cannot move earth without eating. Grain, fish, vegetables, salt, water, tools, sandals, baskets, timber, and shelter had to reach the site. Cooks, carriers, craftsmen, guards, record keepers, and supervisors supported the people doing the visible work. The mound was the final product of a network extending far beyond its moats. Surveying the shape required careful measurement. Builders could use cords, stakes, sight lines, water levels, and repeated checks. Simple tools can establish large geometric plans when used systematically. The difficulty lies less in drawing one curve than in maintaining the correct outline while thousands of loads of earth arrive from different directions. The mound's orientation and profile also had to account for the natural terrain. Moats needed stable banks and controlled water levels. Rainwater could cut channels into unfinished slopes. Construction areas had to remain accessible as the mound grew. Temporary ramps and paths would shift repeatedly. The project may have changed during construction. A ruler's death could create pressure to finish the burial chamber quickly, while work on the surrounding mound continued. Some parts may have been completed for ceremonies before the entire complex reached its final form. Archaeology often presents a monument as one date and one design, but real construction can involve revisions, delays, repairs, and practical compromises. What lies beneath Daisen's round rear section remains one of the greatest unanswered questions in Japanese archaeology. The principal burial facility has not been excavated in the manner of an ordinary archaeological site. The mound is treated by the Imperial Household Agency as an active imperial mausoleum, not simply as an abandoned ruin. Access is therefore tightly controlled. This protection has preserved the monument from the destructive excavation methods used in earlier centuries, but it also limits what can be confirmed. The identification with Emperor Nintoku is traditional rather than proven through the direct examination of the main burial. Early Japanese chronicles describe Nintoku as a ruler associated with the 4th and 5th centuries, but the texts were compiled much later and combine historical memory with court tradition. The tomb's archaeological date and the traditional chronology do not align neatly enough to remove all doubt. This does not mean that the attribution is false. It means that the evidence cannot yet demonstrate the occupant's identity with certainty. Partial discoveries around the mound provide hints. In 1872, a stone compartment was found on the slope of the front section. It contained a chest-shaped stone coffin, armour, swords and glass vessels. The objects were reburied, but detailed illustrated records survived. Older accounts also suggest another stone coffin may lie in the round section, where the principal interment would normally be expected. These finds make the site more complicated. Was the front burial a secondary interment? Did the tomb contain more than one important person? Were some compartments intended mainly for goods? How many phases of ceremony occurred there? Surrounding satellite mounds create further possibilities. They could contain people connected with the main ruler, military equipment, ritual objects, or symbolic deposits. Several survive, while others were lost or altered. The complete funeral landscape may therefore have held a carefully arranged collection of burials and offerings rather than one isolated grave. The limited access has encouraged speculation. Some theories suggest that the mound hides technology, written records from an unknown civilization, unusual metal objects, or a chamber much older than the visible monument. The protected status makes such claims difficult to test, which allows them to grow without much resistance. Yet the evidence around Daisen fits strongly within the 5th century Kofun world. Its shape belongs to an established architectural tradition. Pottery and haniwa associated with the site match the period. Nearby mounds form a chronological sequence. Burial goods recorded from the monument resemble elite objects found elsewhere. The complex did not appear without cultural context. There is no archaeological reason to place the construction before the end of the Ice Age. The mystery is not whether people 10,000 years earlier built the mound and later rulers inherited it. The more serious mystery is which 5th century ruler commanded such resources, how the labour was organised, and what political system made the project possible. This may sound less dramatic than a vanished global civilization, but it is hardly a small question. The builders lived before a fully documented central government left detailed administrative records. Yet they could mobilise enough labour to create one of the largest burial monuments on Earth. Their society was capable of planning across years, coordinating distant communities, importing valuable goods, and presenting royal authority through engineered landscapes. The size of Daisen also creates an illusion about technological difficulty. Moving millions of baskets of earth is not the same problem as lifting 1 million-ton block. The work was enormous, but it could be divided among many people into manageable loads. Each basket might contain only what one worker could carry. The impossible monument emerges through repetition. This is not an explanation that reduces the achievement. Repetition on this scale requires administration. Someone had to decide where each load went, how slopes were compacted, and when workers changed tasks. A badly managed mound would spread, collapse, or trap water. The surviving geometry shows control. The enormous human cost is harder to measure. Labourers could be injured by landslides, falling stones, exhausted animals, broken carts, or simple overwork. Communities supplying food and workers may have faced heavy demands. A monument celebrating one ruler could represent years taken from thousands of ordinary lives. Those workers remain unnamed. The person buried in the mound may be remembered as an emperor, while the builders survive only through the stability of the slopes they created. This is common in monumental history. The patron receives the tomb, the labour force receives a very long day. Still, the project may also have provided meaning, employment, ceremony, and collective identity. People do not build only because they are forced. Participation in a royal funeral could link distant communities to a shared political order. Skilled workers may have taken pride in their knowledge. The completed monument could become a visible statement that their world was organised, protected, and connected to powerful ancestors. The moats reinforced that separation. Water made the mound appear like an island reserved for the dead. Bridges may have provided controlled access during construction or ceremonies. At Ishibutai Kofun, another major tomb in the Mozu group, archaeologists found rows of post holes interpreted as the remains of a substantial wooden bridge crossing the moat. Wooden ceremonial structures may once have been common around large tombs but rarely survive. This reminds us again that the visible earthworks are incomplete. Timber gates, fences, bridges, platforms, shelters, banners, boats and ritual equipment could have surrounded the mounds. Bright haniwa and pale covering stones would have contrasted with the soil. People in ceremonial clothing may have gathered on the front platform while offerings were carried across water. The quiet wooded mound seen today bears little resemblance to that active landscape. When large Kofun construction declined, Japan did not lose the ability to move stone or organize labour. Burial customs changed, Buddhism spread. Temples, palaces, roads, and new forms of tomb took priority. The enormous keyhole mound was no longer the preferred expression of authority. Political power had not vanished. It had found new architecture. Some tombs were respected, some robbed, some reused, and some forgotten beneath farms and forests. Later rulers attached imperial names to important mounds. Shrines developed nearby. Boundaries shifted. Local stories gave individual stones and hills new meanings. This long afterlife is where the question of inheritance becomes more serious. A monument can be created by one culture and used by another without the later people fully understanding its original purpose. Stones can be removed from old tombs and placed into castles. Sacred places can preserve ancient structures while changing every explanation attached to them. The Great Mounds show that early Japanese rulers did not need to inherit their engineering from an Ice Age civilization to build on an astonishing scale. Yet they also occupied landscapes already filled with older settlements, ritual places, quarries, and memories. Their tombs may have absorbed materials, symbols, and sacred locations whose histories reached much farther back than the names later assigned to them. To follow that possibility, we must look at stones that did not remain where their first builders placed them, and at monuments whose visible history may begin long after the rock itself was quarried, shaped, or given meaning. A stone can outlive almost everything that once gave it meaning. The person who ordered it may be forgotten. The workers who shaped it may leave no names behind. The building around it can burn, collapse, or be dismantled, while the stone remains exactly where gravity last persuaded it to stay. Several centuries later, another community may find it, decide that it is useful, sacred, impressive, or simply too heavy to move, and give it an entirely new role. This is one of the difficulties we face when looking at Japan's ancient monuments. A large stone does not always remain inside the culture that first shaped it. Sarcophagi become castle foundations. Tomb mounds become shrine grounds. Quarry blocks are transported into walls far from the mountains where they were cut. A natural boulder can become a sacred object, and once a shrine grows around it, the original landscape begins to look like deliberate architecture. Inheritance can therefore happen in several ways. A later society may physically reuse old material. It may continue visiting an ancient place while changing the rituals performed there. It may preserve the structure but forget its original builders. Or it may encounter something already mysterious, attach a legend to it, and pass that legend forward as though it were the monument's first explanation. This does not require a lost global civilization. It is a normal part of human history. Useful things are reused, important places remain important, and large stones are rarely thrown away because the local recycling service tends to become rather unhelpful when presented with a 5-ton sarcophagus. The tombs of the Kofun period contained enormous quantities of prepared stone. Some had walls formed from rough blocks. Others contained carefully shaped house-like coffins made from stone transported across long distances. When tombs were robbed, damaged, exposed by erosion, or cleared for later construction, those materials became available again. To a castle builder working under pressure, an ancient coffin lid was no longer necessarily a sacred burial object. It was a broad, strong slab that had already been quarried, shaped, and moved once. Reusing it saved time. The dead person originally associated with it may have been forgotten for 1,000 years, while the stone remained perfectly suitable for supporting a wall. At Osaka Castle in Mie Prefecture, this process can still be seen. The castle was built at the end of the 16th century, and its construction was completed rapidly. Stones were gathered from many available sources. Some had been split specifically for the walls, while others had earlier lives. The surviving ruins include stone coffin lids taken from ancient tombs and reused in the foundations of the castle tower. Another block incorporated into a drain is thought to have come from a temple sculpture. The castle walls are therefore not made from one single moment in time. They contain pieces of landscapes and monuments that were already old when the castle was new. Himeji Castle provides another clear example. Its early stone walls include natural rocks gathered locally, but builders also reused old grinding stones, gravestones, and pieces of stone coffins when suitable material was difficult to obtain. An object made for preparing grain or protecting the dead could become an anonymous component in a defensive wall. Its earlier meaning did not make it physically less useful. This changes the way we should look at unusual stones found inside later monuments. A block in a castle wall may be older than the castle. A carved surface facing inward may belong to a previous object. A stone that appears strangely precise compared with those around it may not have been prepared by the same workers or for the same purpose. Yet reuse can also produce misleading theories. If one stone in a 16th century wall came from a Kofun period tomb, that does not mean the entire castle was inherited from the Kofun builders. It means the castle builders were practical. Archaeologists must separate the date of the material, the date of its first shaping, and the date when it entered its present structure. These dates are not always the same. The rock itself may be millions of years old. The first cut may have been made 1,500 years ago. The second set of tool marks may belong to a castle mason working 1,000 years later. A modern repair may add metal supports. All of those moments can survive on one surface. Reading them requires attention to tool marks, weathering, soil layers, construction joints, quarry sources, and the position of the stone within the building. A carved block found loose in a field tells us much less than one discovered inside an undisturbed wall whose surrounding material can be dated. Context is the difference between an object with a history and an object with a very impressive collection of guesses. The great stones of Osaka Castle show how well a large block can be understood when enough context survives. Near the Sakuramon Gate stands the Kame-ishi, or Octopus Stone. Its visible face measures nearly 60 square meters, and its weight is estimated at about 108 tons. It was installed in 1624 during the Tokugawa rebuilding of the castle. The stone was quarried in Bizen, in what is now Okayama Prefecture, and transported more than 100 kilometers to Osaka. Its name comes from a mottled shape on the surface that resembles an octopus, although the creature has shown admirable restraint by remaining flat against the wall. At first glance, the stone appears to present the same mystery as Baalbek or other famous megalithic sites. How could people without modern trucks and cranes move such a mass across a region and place it into a wall? In this case, the historical setting supplies much of the answer. The Tokugawa government ordered powerful regional lords to contribute labour and material to the rebuilding. Quarrying took place around the Seto Inland Sea, where water transport allowed heavy blocks to move more efficiently than they could across mountain roads. The stones could be shaped near the quarry, lowered to shore, loaded onto strongly built vessels, carried through protected inland waters, and unloaded near the castle. Moving the Kame-ishi was still an exceptional achievement. Ropes could break, ships could become unstable. Loading and unloading placed enormous forces on timber structures. The final journey over land required prepared paths, sledges, rollers, levers, earth ramps, and coordinated teams. But there is a major difference between difficult and unexplained. We know who controlled the rebuilding, When this portion of the wall was constructed, where the stone came from and why it was placed at a major gateway, huge facing stones were statements of power. An approaching visitor was supposed to notice them. The block did not need to fill the entire thickness of the wall. Its enormous face created the visual effect, while stones behind it supported the structure. This is common in monumental construction. What appears to be a gigantic solid cube may be a broad slab selected because its front surface looks impressive. The ruler receives the appearance of moving a small mountain without needing to move quite as much mountain as the visitor imagines. The quarries connected with Osaka Castle still preserve abandoned blocks, wedge holes, clan marks, and incomplete stones. On Shodoshima and neighbouring islands, thousands of prepared or partly prepared stones remain near old working areas. Some were never transported because construction needs changed, a block cracked, a shipment was cancelled, or the project ended before the quarry's full output was required. These abandoned stones are valuable because they preserve the stages between mountain and wall. A finished castle shows the successful blocks. A quarry shows the failures, experiments, cutting sequences, and pieces left behind. Together they reveal an industry rather than a miracle. Without the quarry evidence, the takoishi might look inherited from an unknown ancient culture. With the quarry, transport route, historical rebuilding program, and surviving masonry traditions, it becomes a documented example of early modern engineering. Osaka Castle also contains a more literal example of one civilization building over another. Toyotomi Hideyoshi began constructing his castle there in the late 16th century. After the Toyotomi family was defeated in 1615, the Tokugawa shogunate rebuilt the site on a different scale. The earlier walls were buried beneath large quantities of earth, while new foundations and fortifications rose above them. For centuries, visitors saw the Tokugawa stonework and often assumed it represented the castle of Hideyoshi. Excavation revealed that substantial sections of the earlier Toyotomi walls remained below ground. A museum opened in 2025 now allows visitors to descend and view one of these buried structures directly. The site contains two castles layered vertically, one political order placed over the physical remains of the one it defeated. This is inheritance through conquest, although the purpose was not respectful preservation. The Tokugawa builders covered the previous castle and created their own monument above it, yet burial protected parts of the earlier walls from later weather and rebuilding. An attempt to replace one political symbol unintentionally preserved part of it. History often works this way. Destruction is incomplete. New buildings trap old foundations beneath floors. Walls become retaining structures. Moats are filled but remain visible in soil patterns. A later capital can stand directly over the streets of an earlier one. When archaeologists discover such layers, it may appear that two technologies or building styles exist at the same site. That observation is correct. The mistake would be assuming they belong to one construction phase. A rough lower wall may be older than a precise upper wall. A carefully cut block may have been inserted during repair. A foundation may follow an earlier boundary because builders reused the existing terrain. The monument seen today can be a conversation between centuries, although most of the participants were unaware that they were having one. The same principle applies to religious landscapes. In Japan, unusual rocks and mountains often became places of worship. The term Iwakura refers broadly to sacred rock formations associated with the presence or descent of kami. Rituals repeated at such places could make the rock itself an object of reverence. In some shrine settings, the sacred formation stands behind or within the later sanctuary, suggesting that the stone was important before permanent shrine buildings appeared. Archaeological evidence for ritual activity around stones extends into prehistoric periods, becoming especially visible during the Yayoi and Kofun eras. A shrine can therefore inherit a stone without inheriting a complete explanation of its earliest meaning. The later community may know that the place is sacred but tell a different story about why. A local deity may replace an older one. Buddhist figures may be carved onto a rock already treated as powerful. A path, gate, offering area and shrine hall may gradually turn a natural formation into what looks like a planned megalithic complex. This does not make the sacred history false. Meaning can be real even when it changes. It does, however, make dating difficult. The date of a modern shrine building cannot tell us when people first gathered beside the rock. A legend written down in the 8th century may describe a tradition that existed earlier, but it may also contain ideas developed close to the time of writing. Ishi-no-Hoden shows this process clearly. The block may have begun as an unfinished Kofun period project connected with the Tatsuyama quarry tradition. By the early 8th century, it was already notable enough to appear in a provincial record. It later became the sacred focus of a shrine and acquired stories of divine construction. Each stage is part of the stone's history, yet they should not be collapsed into one event. The workers who cut it may not have worshipped it in the same way as later visitors. The legend may preserve the memory that it was unfinished without preserving the historical identity of the builders. Kame-ishi may have followed a similar path. It could have been a boundary marker, decorative object, ritual carving, or part of a larger Asuka period complex. Once that setting disappeared, the stone remained. Later people saw a turtle, noticed its orientation, and developed a story about its power to turn and flood the land. The legend became a form of cultural inheritance. It protected attention around the object even after its administrative or ceremonial function vanished. A stone with a story is less likely to be broken for a wall than a stone regarded as inconveniently placed landscaping. Tomb mounds themselves were also reused as sacred places. Research on surviving Kofun in Tokyo has identified later uses as cemeteries, shrine and temple precincts, miniature Mount Fuji mounds, garden features, signposts, sources of soil, and sources of stone. The shape or elevated position could retain a sense of separation and importance even after knowledge of the original burial faded. This may explain why some ancient monuments survived in crowded urban areas while others disappeared. A mound absorbed into a shrine remained protected by custom. One treated merely as unused earth could be levelled for construction. Sacred inheritance can preserve a site more effectively than historical understanding. At the same time, later religious use can disturb the archaeology. New graves are dug into old mounds. Trees grow through burial layers. Paths cut across terraces. Buildings require foundations. Objects are moved and displayed. Preservation and alteration occur together. A modern archaeologist may encounter a Kofun period tomb covered by an Edo period shrine landscape and surrounded by 20th century roads. Every part is historically meaningful, but only some parts belong to the original monument. This layered pattern allows us to consider a more cautious version of the inherited megastructure theory. Later Japanese societies certainly inherited older places. They reused tombstones, occupied ancient mounds, built shrines around unusual rocks, and constructed new fortifications over earlier foundations. The evidence for this is direct and widespread. What has not been demonstrated is that Japan's known megaliths were inherited from a single, technologically advanced civilization existing before the end of the last ice age. To support that larger claim, we would need a consistent group of monuments securely dated to that remote period, accompanied by tools, settlements, production waste, transport evidence, and cultural materials that belong to the same builders. Instead, the sites examined so far fall into several identifiable historical settings. The quarries of Mount Nokogiri and Oya belong largely to documented later industries. Ishi-no-Hoden fits within an ancient quarry region, used for Kofun sarcophagi and later architecture. Sakafune-ishi belongs within an Asuka period landscape of controlled water and court ritual. Ishibutai and the Mozu tombs belong to the development of elite burial and early state authority. Osaka Castle's giant stones belong to a well-recorded 17th century construction program. This does not remove their mysteries. A cultural setting can be known while the exact function of an object remains uncertain. We may understand the type of society that built something without knowing the name of its designer or the ceremony performed there. Inheritance also makes certainty harder, because later activity can erase the evidence we most need. A reused sarcophagus loses its original grave. A sacred stone may be cleaned, moved, or surrounded by new construction. A castle wall can hide the carved face of an older object. A quarry may continue operating for centuries, cutting through its earliest working levels. The first people to use a site may leave the least visible evidence because every later generation has had an opportunity to disturb it. Archaeology is sometimes less like opening a sealed box and more like examining a kitchen that has been used continuously for 2,000 years. There are many clues, but someone has moved nearly everything, and nobody remembers where the original spoon was kept. There is another reason inherited monuments attract lost civilization theories. Later builders sometimes appear less capable than the structures they occupy. A ruined wall may use blocks larger than those in nearby houses. A local legend may say that giants or gods built it. The people encountered by the first written records may not describe the engineering methods used centuries earlier. This creates an apparent break. The monument seems to belong to a level of skill absent from the later culture. But skills are not permanent possessions of an entire civilization. A specialized stone industry can grow and decline. Quarry routes can close. Political rulers can stop funding large projects. Craftspeople can shift to different materials. Knowledge may survive only among a few families and disappear when demand ends. The builders of a 17th century castle could move stones that an ordinary village of the same period could not. That does not mean the village inherited the castle from another species. It means specialized projects concentrate resources in ways everyday life does not. The Kofun builders similarly possessed labor systems and funerary specialists that later communities did not always maintain. When mound construction ended, the ability to organize a 500-meter tomb was no longer required. The disappearance of the practice was not necessarily the disappearance of intelligence. Society had changed what it considered worth building. This may be the quiet lesson inside Japan's inherited stones. The same material can pass between people who understand it differently. One generation sees a coffin. Another sees a foundation slab. One sees a failed quarry project. Another sees the resting place of a deity. One ruler sees an enemy's castle and buries it. Archaeologists centuries later see a protected layer of evidence beneath the replacement. A forgotten global civilization is one possible story people place over these layers, but it is not the only one. The documented pattern is more local, gradual, and human. Monuments were built, abandoned, rediscovered, reused, renamed, and protected. Their meanings changed while their weight remained stubbornly constant. There may still be older phases hidden beneath known sites. Japan's earthquakes, volcanic deposits, dense settlement, and continuous rebuilding make discovery difficult. New excavation can reveal foundations below foundations. Scientific analysis can identify a quarry source far from a stone's present location. Microscopic wear can separate one episode of carving from another. Yet even the most advanced analysis depends on context. A stone lifted from the sea floor without associated artifacts is especially difficult to interpret. Water can move loose objects, remove sediment, and expose natural fractures. Rising seas can cover genuine human sites, while marine erosion reshapes them into forms that appear more architectural than they once were. This is why Japan's most controversial possible inherited monument does not stand beneath a castle or inside a shrine. It lies underwater near Yonaguni, where enormous terraces, steps, channels, and flat walls seem to descend into the sea. There, the question of inheritance becomes more complicated. Perhaps people modified a natural rock formation, while the coastline was different. Perhaps later islanders preserved stories of a place already lost beneath the waves. Perhaps the entire structure was created by geology, leaving human imagination to complete the architecture. To judge it, we must compare what the ocean can carve with what people can build, then place Yonaguni beside other megalithic landscapes across the world where the same shapes, the same enormous blocks, and many of the same questions appear again. The stones reused in castles, shrines and tombs remain on dry land, where archaeologists can examine the soil around them, compare tool marks, trace quarry routes, and search for objects left by the people who work there. Yonaguni offers none of those comforts. Its most famous formation lies beneath the sea, surrounded by strong currents, shifting light, marine growth, and water deep enough to turn every investigation into a carefully planned dive. Yonaguni is Japan's westernmost inhabited island, sitting much closer to Taiwan than to the main islands of Japan. Its cliffs rise sharply from the ocean, and the surrounding waters are known for powerful currents. During winter, divers visit to see schools of hammerhead sharks, which would already be enough excitement for most afternoons. In 1986, a local diving operator named Kihachiro Aratake was searching for a good place to observe the sharks when he encountered a much larger surprise on the seabed. Below the southern coast was an enormous rock formation, made of broad horizontal platforms, steep vertical faces, narrow ledges, and step-like terraces. Some corners appeared remarkably sharp. Channels ran between raised areas. One large section looked like a staircase cut into the side of a monumental platform. From certain viewpoints, the whole formation resembled the lower levels of a submerged temple or pyramid. It became known as the Yonaguni Monument. The site is not a collection of individual blocks stacked like a wall. Most of the formation is connected to the underlying bedrock. It consists mainly of sandstone and mudstone belonging to the Yaeyama geological group, formed millions of years before humans appeared. The visible question is therefore not whether people carried the entire structure into place. No one imagines an ancient workforce towing a mountain through the sea. The argument concerns whether the bedrock was shaped entirely by natural forces or whether people modified a natural formation when it stood closer to the surface. This distinction is important because the debate is often presented as a choice between a completely artificial city and a completely meaningless natural rock. Reality may be less cooperative. Human communities frequently use natural formations without building them from the beginning. A cliff can be cut into steps, a cave can be widened, a flat rock can become a ceremonial platform after only modest alteration. A natural harbour can be improved with walls and channels. If people used Yonaguni, they may have selected a formation that already looked impressive and adjusted parts of it. That would make the site archaeological, without requiring every straight edge to have been carved by hand. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus became the best-known supporter of human involvement. After years of diving and mapping, he argued that various features resembled roads, terraces, walls, drainage channels, steps, plazas, and carved monuments. He suggested that the site may have been modified by an ancient culture and later submerged through changes in sea level or local tectonic movement. Some versions of the theory place the work near the end of the last ice age, when global sea levels were much lower than they are today. In that interpretation, the structure could have stood above water more than 10,000 years ago. If it were demonstrated to be a large human-built complex from that period, it would force major changes in our understanding of prehistoric societies in East Asia. That possibility explains much of the excitement surrounding Yonaguni. An ordinary later settlement beneath the sea would be important. A monumental Ice Age centre would be extraordinary. The date, however, cannot be established simply by measuring the present depth. Sea level did not rise at the same rate in every place, and the local geology of the Ryukyu Islands is active. Land can rise, sink, tilt and fracture during earthquakes. A platform now 20 metres underwater was not necessarily 20 metres above the shoreline at one easily calculated date. Kimura also revised parts of his proposed chronology over time, at one point suggesting that significant activity may have occurred only a few thousand years ago, rather than before the end of the Ice Age. This creates a much less dramatic but more archaeologically plausible possibility. Coastal people might have used or modified the formation when it was still partly exposed accessible at low tide, or situated differently because of local geological movement. The strongest argument for a natural origin begins with the rock itself. Sandstone often forms in layers. These bedding planes can separate along broad horizontal surfaces. Vertical joints cut across those layers, creating natural fractures that meet at angles. When waves, currents, earthquakes, and weathering act on such rock, slabs break away. The remaining formation can develop flat terraces, straight walls, narrow steps, and rectangular corners. This sounds convenient until similar formations are seen above water. On Yonaguni Island, exposed coastal sandstone displays ledges, platforms, and angular fractures that resemble features on the submerged monument. The same geological structure continues from the island into the sea. To geologists who favour a natural explanation, the underwater formation is a particularly dramatic example of processes visible across the local landscape. The island is also earthquake-prone. Repeated movement can widen joints and detach large sections of rock. Waves then remove weaker material while leaving stronger layers behind. Powerful currents sweep loose debris from exposed surfaces, which may explain why some terraces look unexpectedly clean. A natural stair-like formation does not require nature to carve each step carefully. It only requires layered rock to break along existing weaknesses. Robert Shaw, a geologist often associated with arguments for older dates at the Great Sphinx of Egypt, examined Yonaguni and concluded that the formation was overwhelmingly natural. He did not completely reject possible human activity. His view was that ancient inhabitants may have visited, used, or altered limited parts of a naturally formed site. That position sits between the two popular extremes and is often lost because mostly natural with possible modification makes a rather less energetic headline than Japan's Atlantis discovered. The human eye contributes another difficulty. We are exceptionally good at finding designed forms. This ability helps us recognize paths, shelters, faces, and tools. It can also cause us to interpret natural geometry as architecture. A broad rectangular ledge becomes a plaza. A broken edge becomes a staircase. Two parallel cracks become a road. A rounded boulder becomes a carved head. Once someone labels a feature, later visitors find it difficult not to see the same thing. This does not mean they are foolish. Perception works through comparison. A diver who has seen ancient terraces in Peru may notice terraces at Yonaguni. Someone familiar with temple platforms may interpret the broad upper surface as a ceremonial level. The rock supplies the shape, while memory supplies the function. Underwater visibility can strengthen this effect. Light changes with depth and weather. Shadows make shallow grooves look deep. Marine growth softens some surfaces and outlines others. A diver is moving rather than examining the site from a fixed platform. Strong currents reduce the time available to inspect one corner closely. Video footage often uses wide-angle lenses that alter scale and distance. The site feels architectural before the evidence has been sorted. A confirmed human structure would normally be supported by more than geometry. Archaeologists would search for tool marks that cannot be explained by erosion, loose blocks intentionally positioned against gravity, carved surfaces showing repeated impact patterns, pathways connected to occupation areas, and artifacts within securely dated layers. They would hope to find pottery, stone tools, food remains, hearths, burials, post holes, anchors, cut timbers, or waste produced during construction. One artifact lying nearby would not be enough because currents can move objects. The important evidence would be a repeated association between human material and the structure itself. At Yonaguni, no widely accepted collection of such evidence has established the formation as a constructed monument. Claims have been made for carvings, tool marks, and nearby artifacts, but none has created a consensus among archaeologists. The site has not produced the kind of sealed cultural layer that would allow investigators to say that a particular community worked on a particular surface at a particular time. This absence does not prove that no one ever used the formation. Coastal archaeological evidence is difficult to preserve and even harder to excavate underwater. Sediment can be removed, redeposited, or carried away. Organic material decays. Shell and coral growth can cover older surfaces. Repeated earthquakes may destroy the relationship between objects and their original positions. But the absence does limit how confidently the stronger claims can be made. A possible human modification is not the same as a city. A city is not the same as an advanced civilization. And an advanced civilization on one island is not automatically evidence for a global culture that built similar monuments on several continents. The global comparison begins because Yonaguni resembles places whose artificial origin is not disputed. At Pumapunku in Bolivia, large sandstone and andesite blocks were cut into complex forms as part of the Tiwanaku ceremonial centre. Some contain repeated recesses, straight channels, and carefully prepared faces. Metal clamps helped connect elements, while monumental platforms and drainage systems reveal organised architectural planning. Modern reconstruction studies have shown that many scattered fragments can be fitted into intelligible building forms rather than treated as isolated technological puzzles. Photographs of the famous H-shaped blocks often give the impression that they were produced on an industrial machine, yet ancient stoneworkers could establish repeated measurements using templates, chords, squares, straight edges, abrasives, and skilled finishing. Copper alloy and stone tools do not operate as quickly as modern cutting equipment, but speed is not the only measure of capability. Pumapunku is also surrounded by the larger Tiwanaku archaeological landscape. There are temples, platforms, settlement areas, ceramics, burials, agricultural systems, and datable cultural remains. The stones do not float outside history. Their design belongs to a society that lived there, developed there, and left many forms of evidence beyond the most dramatic blocks. This is the context Yonaguni lacks. At Baalbek in Lebanon, the scale changes again. The Roman sanctuary includes gigantic stones in the terrace supporting the Temple of Jupiter. Several blocks exceed hundreds of tons. In the nearby quarry, even larger monoliths remain partly attached to the bedrock, preserving stages of extraction. The site grew across a long period, combining Roman imperial construction with older sacred traditions. The blocks appear impossible when shown without the quarry or architectural setting. With the surrounding evidence, they become difficult but understandable products of a powerful ancient construction program. The builders had roads, lifting devices, capstans, ropes, rollers, ramps, cranes, organised labour, and generations of experience with monumental stone. Scholars still debate details of chronology and placement. We may not know the exact sequence used to move every block, yet uncertainty about one operation does not erase the Roman and regional context of the complex. Near Nanjing in China, the Yangshan Quarry contains 3 enormous unfinished components intended for a monumental stele commissioned during the early Ming dynasty. The base, body, and head were cut directly from the mountain but never removed. Together, they would have formed an object of almost absurd size. The abandoned pieces are sometimes presented as evidence that unknown builders attempted something beyond later Chinese capability. Historical context suggests another explanation. The project was ordered under an emperor capable of mobilizing enormous labour, but practical limits became clear. The stone was too large to transport and erect safely. Work stopped, leaving a monument to imperial ambition and the useful discovery that even an emperor cannot negotiate successfully with several thousand tons of rock. Like Ishi-no-Hoden and Masuda-no-Iwafune, Yangshan shows how an unfinished object can appear more mysterious than a completed one. We see the impossible stage because the workers never reached the part where their methods would have become obvious. China's Longyu Caverns and Washan Grottos provide another comparison. These are vast artificial underground spaces carved from solid rock. Their walls and pillars carry repeated chisel patterns, and their scale implies organised labour and careful understanding of structural support. Researchers examining the Longyu caverns have discussed how ancient excavators selected locations and adjusted layouts in response to geological stability. The amount of removed stone is enormous, yet the chambers are clearly human-made. Their mystery concerns purpose, exact age, workforce, and the location of the excavated material. No unknown energy weapon is needed to explain the marks. The greater puzzle is why communities invested so much effort underground, and why written accounts do not provide a clear answer. Mount Nokogiri and Oya teach the same lesson in Japan. Large excavated spaces can become detached from the industries that created them. Once tools, carts, workers, and daily noise disappear, the remaining void looks ceremonial. Egypt and Peru add countless examples of stone surfaces that appear astonishingly regular. Egyptian builders cut granite, limestone, basalt, and sandstone for temples, statues, coffins, obelisks, and pyramids. Andean builders fitted irregular blocks into stable walls that survived centuries of earthquakes. Their techniques were not identical because their materials, landscapes, tools, and architectural traditions differed. The global pattern is therefore not one method. It is a repeated human willingness to invest extraordinary labour in stone. Large stones communicate permanence. They resist fire and weather. They make political authority visible. They connect rulers with ancestors and deities. They create ceremonial spaces that can outlast ordinary houses. A timber palace may disappear, while its foundation blocks remain to suggest that the people who built it cared only about stone. Similar motivations can produce similar structures without a shared global architect. A platform is useful because it creates a level surface. Steps solve the problem of changing height. Walls divide space. Pits hold posts, water, or offerings. Channels direct liquid. Rectangular blocks stack efficiently. Human bodies and gravity remain broadly similar wherever construction takes place. Nature uses some of the same geometry for different reasons. Cooling lava forms columns. Sedimentary rock separates into layers. Crystals grow with straight faces. Joints meet at angles. Erosion removes weaker material and leaves terraces behind. The world contains both natural megalithic patterns and artificial ones. The difficult sites are those where the two overlap. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey is important because it changed expectations without requiring a lost industrial civilization. Its monumental enclosures and carved T-shaped pillars were built by communities near the end of the last ice age, during the 10th and 9th millennia before the Common Era. These groups were hunter-gatherers or early settled communities living before fully developed agricultural states. The site proves that large communal stone construction could appear earlier than many scholars once assumed. The discovery did not show that prehistoric people had modern machines. It showed that earlier assumptions about social organisation were too limited. Communities could gather labour, quarry limestone, move pillars, carve animals, organise food, and create shared ritual spaces without kings, armies, or written administration of the later kind. This is the more responsible way to let archaeology challenge a timeline. Evidence appears in a secure context. Structures are excavated with tools, food remains, occupation layers, carvings, and datable material. Scholars adjust their understanding because the complete archaeological record demands it. Yonaguni has not yet produced an equivalent record. That does not make it unimportant. If the formation is entirely natural, it remains a remarkable example of how geology creates apparent architecture. If it was used and modified by ancient people, it may preserve evidence of a coastal ritual or settlement landscape partly lost to the sea. If future discoveries demonstrate extensive human construction, the site could become one of the most significant archaeological locations in the Western Pacific. For now, those possibilities should remain separate rather than being treated as one confirmed story. The strongest version of the lost civilization theory connects Yonaguni with Pumapunku, Baalbek, Egypt, Peru, China, Turkey, and Japan's own monoliths. Similar stoneworking, it argues, may reflect a seafaring culture that spread engineering knowledge around the world before a catastrophe destroyed its centres near the end of the Ice Age. Rising sea levels certainly flooded enormous areas of habitable land. Coastal plains disappeared around every continent. Human communities were forced to move. Archaeological evidence now rests beneath the North Sea, the Persian Gulf, the waters around Southeast Asia, and coastlines throughout the Pacific. People also travelled by sea earlier and farther than older historical models once allowed. Reaching islands required boats, navigation, planning, and social networks. The possibility that prehistoric communities exchanged ideas across substantial distances should not be dismissed. The problem appears when possibility becomes a complete global explanation without the connecting evidence. Shared architecture should be accompanied by shared tools, symbols, construction sequences, settlement forms, genetic relationships, traded materials, or datable transitions showing how knowledge moved. Some ancient cultures were connected through trade. Others developed similar solutions independently. A precise stone block in Bolivia and a stepped sandstone formation near Japan do not establish contact by themselves. Their distance, materials, dates, and archaeological settings matter more than their appearance in two carefully selected photographs. It is also worth asking what an advanced prehistoric civilization would leave behind beyond stone. Large construction requires food production or dependable resource systems, transport, tools, skilled specialists, and places for workers to live. If metal machines existed, mining sites, slag, broken parts, and chemical traces should survive somewhere. If ships crossed oceans regularly, harbours, cargo, and introduced species might reveal the routes. A civilization can be damaged by catastrophe, but removing every ordinary trace while leaving only its heaviest monuments would require a very selective disaster. The attraction of the theory remains understandable. Conventional histories have underestimated ancient people many times. Sites such as Göbekli Tepe forced genuine revision. New underwater archaeology will almost certainly reveal settlements along drowned Ice Age coastlines. Every generation discovers that prehistoric communities were more mobile, skilled, and socially complex than earlier textbooks suggested. The lesson, however, is not that every extraordinary claim must be true. It is that evidence should be followed even when it changes expectations. Yonaguni deserves careful mapping, geological sampling, underwater excavation where practical and open comparison between competing explanations. Researchers should search for surfaces that show unmistakable modification, not merely straightness. Sediment pockets may preserve artifacts protected from currents. Nearby caves or former shoreline areas could contain occupation evidence connected with periods of lower sea level. A single secure discovery could change the debate. A shaped stone tool embedded beneath an altered terrace would be more valuable than hundreds of photographs of right angles. A datable hearth in a protected cavity would begin connecting people to place. Repeated cut marks found beneath marine weathering could distinguish carving from natural fracture. Until then, the monument remains balanced between geology and archaeology. Perhaps ancient islanders saw the formation when more of it was exposed. They may have fished from its ledges, tied boats near it, gathered there for ceremonies, or told stories about the strange steps descending into the water. A natural formation could become part of human culture without being a city. The distinction may have mattered less to them than it does to us. Modern investigators ask whether nature or people made the monument. Ancient communities may have seen no sharp boundary. A powerful place could be shaped by the land and completed through ritual use. This possibility returns us to Japan's older traditions. Mountains, rocks, springs, caves, and islands often became sacred without needing to be constructed. A naturally formed terrace could acquire the importance of a temple because people treated it as one. The monument would then be both geological and cultural. though not in the way either extreme side usually describes it. The global pattern also becomes more interesting when viewed this way. People did not always impose architecture upon empty landscapes. They selected places where geology already offered unusual forms. A cliff suggested a wall, a hill became a mound, a cave became a chamber, a large boulder became the body of a deity. Human work refined what the environment provided. Japan's megaliths may contain many examples of this partnership. Ishi-no-Hoden was carved from bedrock rather than assembled. Masuda-no-Iwafune began as a natural granite mass. Oya's chambers follow the properties of volcanic tuff. Kofun builders incorporated terrain into mound design. Yonaguni may represent the most difficult version because the possible human contribution is now hidden beneath weathering and water. The question is no longer simply whether a forgotten civilization built everything. It is how different communities recognized useful or sacred shapes, how much they altered them, and how later people inherited the result. This brings us back toward the people whose names are only partly visible in early records. By the time Chinese writers described the islands of Wa, Japan already contained powerful communities, ritual specialists, fortified settlements, long-distance trade, and rulers capable of drawing several regions into alliances. Among those rulers was a woman named Himiko. Chinese envoys described her as a queen who governed through ritual authority, yet Japanese chronicles do not identify her clearly. Her kingdom, Yamatai, has never been located with certainty. Some place it in Kyushu, closer to the routes leading toward the continent. Others place it near the emerging political centres of the Kinai region, where the largest early tombs would later rise. The uncertainty surrounding Himiko is different from the debate over Yonaguni, but the two questions meet at the same point. How much of Japan's early world existed before written history began, and how much was inherited, reorganised, or deliberately forgotten when new rulers created the version of the past that survived? The steps beneath the water at Yonaguni bring us to the edge of a much older question. If part of Japan's human landscape disappeared beneath rising seas, how much history was lost before anyone began writing it down? And when written records finally appeared, were they describing a new political world, or the latest form of something that had been developing across the islands for thousands of years? The first detailed written description of a named ruler in ancient Japan did not come from Japan. It came from China. During the 3rd century, Chinese officials gathered information about the islands they called Wa, a region divided among many communities and local rulers. Their account described travel routes, clothing, agriculture, trade, social rank, warfare, ritual, and a powerful queen named Himiko. This immediately creates an unusual situation. One of the most important figures in early Japanese history appears clearly in a foreign record, yet she is not clearly named in Japan's earliest surviving historical chronicles. She enters history from across the sea, receives gifts from an emperor, rules a federation of communities, and then seems to disappear behind the later traditions of the Japanese court. According to the Chinese account preserved in the records of Wei, the communities of Wa had experienced a long period of conflict. A woman named Himiko was eventually chosen as ruler, and the disorder decreased. The text presents her as someone who exercised authority through spiritual or ritual practices. She remained unmarried, lived in relative seclusion, and was rarely seen by ordinary people. A younger brother helped administer the government, while attendants and guards controlled access to her residence. It is a description that feels both political and ceremonial. Himiko was not simply sitting in a hut making occasional predictions about the weather. She ruled a network of communities large enough to conduct diplomacy, send envoys abroad, manage rivalries, and gain recognition from one of the major states of China. At the same time, her separation from the public may have been an essential part of her authority. A ruler who appeared every morning to complain about deliveries and inspect drainage ditches might seem ordinary. A ruler hidden behind gates, attended by ritual specialists, and believed to communicate with forces beyond everyday life could become something more powerful. the Chinese court understood foreign diplomacy through its own political language. When Himiko's envoys reached Wei, the emperor recognized her as a friendly ruler of Wa. The gifts sent in return included bronze mirrors, cloth, weapons, and an official title. These objects were not merely generous presents, they confirmed a relationship. By receiving them, Himiko could demonstrate that a distant and prestigious court acknowledged her position. Imagine the effect of those objects when they returned to the islands. Bronze mirrors were valuable, technically sophisticated, and visually impressive. Their polished surfaces reflected faces in a world where clear personal reflection was not available from an ordinary household mirror. Their backs carried detailed patterns, animals, deities, and inscriptions. A mirror could be diplomatic evidence, ritual equipment, an heirloom, or a symbol of authority. It could be displayed, buried, copied, exchanged, or broken into pieces and distributed. Unfortunately for archaeologists, none arrived with a small permanent label reading, "Property of Queen Himiko. Please return to Yamatai." Bronze mirrors found in Japanese tombs have therefore become central to the search. Some scholars have suggested that particular triangular-rimmed mirrors decorated with gods and mythical animals may be connected with the 100 mirrors mentioned in the Chinese record. Others argue that the dating, production, and distribution are more complicated. A mirror resembling the right type is not automatically one of Himiko's diplomatic gifts, especially when similar objects could be made, copied, or circulated for generations. This problem runs through the entire search for Yamatai. The written account gives enough detail to make the kingdom seem almost reachable, but not enough to place it securely on a modern map. The Chinese travellers described a route from the Korean peninsula through islands and communities that can be connected with places in northern Kyushu. They passed Tsushima and Iki, then reached areas with names that appear to correspond to settlements near the coast. Up to that point, the journey is reasonably understandable. Afterward, the distances and directions become much more difficult. Following them literally can place Yamatai in the sea or far beyond any sensible destination. Perhaps a distance was copied incorrectly. Perhaps travel time included waiting, detours, or several stages. Perhaps directions were based on reports rather than direct measurement. Ancient travel documents were not produced by a navigation application quietly correcting everyone after a wrong turn. This uncertainty created the two most famous locations proposed for Yamatai. One places it in northern Kyushu, close to the routes connecting the Japanese islands with Korea and China. The other places it in the Kinai region, around the Nara Basin, where the early Yamato state and the first gigantic keyhole tombs appeared. The northern Kyushu argument begins with geography. An envoy arriving from the continent would naturally enter through this region. Northern Kyushu had long-distance trade, agricultural settlements, metalworking, fortified communities, bronze objects, and strong connections across the sea. The Yoshinogari site in Saga Prefecture demonstrates how organised a Yayoi period community could become. It contained large moats, defended areas, post-built structures, storage buildings, watchtower-like constructions, cemeteries, and spaces that appear to have served ritual or political functions. The occupation developed across a long period, and the reconstructed park now gives visitors an impression of a community much larger and more structured than a simple farming village. Standing among the reconstructed raised buildings and enclosed areas, it is easy to imagine a ruler like Himiko living there. The settlement's defences fit a period of competition. Its ritual spaces fit the account of a queen whose authority included spiritual practices. Its location fits the approach from the continent. Yet an impressive fit is still not identification. No inscription has been found saying that Yoshinogari was Yamatai. No grave has been securely identified as Himiko's. The site shows what a major northern Kyushu centre could look like, but several important settlements existed in the region. The Chinese account describes a political federation. not necessarily one easily recognised capital surrounded by a neat border. The Kinai argument turns our attention back to Nara, not far from the carved stones and Asuka monuments we have already examined. There, the Makimuku site developed during the late Yayoi and early Kofun periods. It covered a broad area and contained large buildings, channels, ritual features and pottery arriving from many parts of the archipelago. This mixture of material suggests that Makimuku was not an ordinary local village. People, objects and political relationships converged there. Its growth occurred close to the period when Himiko ruled, and the region soon became the centre of the earliest enormous keyhole-shaped tombs. For supporters of the Kinai theory, this is the beginning of the Yamato state becoming archaeologically visible. Nearby stands Ishibutai Kofun, a great keyhole-shaped mound roughly 280 metres long. Its construction belongs close to the middle of the 3rd century, making it one of the earliest monuments of its type and placing it near the period of Himiko's death. The Chinese account says that after Himiko died, a large mound was raised for her. This has made Ishibutai one of the leading candidates for her tomb. The timing is attractive. The scale fits a ruler of exceptional status. The surrounding political landscape appears important enough to have been Yamatai. But once again, attractive is not the same as proven. Ishibutai is officially treated as an imperial tomb associated with a figure from later Japanese tradition, and access to the mound is limited. Its burial chamber has not been excavated in a way that could identify the occupant. No inscription naming Himiko has appeared. The size described in the Chinese text does not match the mound perfectly, although ancient units, reporting, and copying can all create uncertainty. There is also the awkward silence of Japan's early chronicles. The Kojiki and Nihon Shoki were compiled centuries after Himiko's lifetime. They describe divine ancestors, early emperors, migrations, wars, marriages, and court traditions. Yet they do not plainly introduce a 3rd century queen named Himiko ruling Yamatai. Perhaps she appears under another identity. Scholars have compared her with several women in Japanese tradition, including priestly princesses and the legendary Empress Jingu. None matches the Chinese account without serious chronological and biographical problems. Perhaps later court historians deliberately placed her story within another royal figure. Perhaps they did not recognise the foreign transcription of her name. Perhaps Yamatai was a rival polity whose memory did not fit the genealogy promoted by the later Yamato court. Or perhaps the Chinese observers misunderstood a title, office, or political arrangement that looked different from inside the islands. Records are not neutral windows. Chinese officials wrote from the viewpoint of an imperial court dealing with distant peoples. Japanese court historians wrote to explain and strengthen the legitimacy of their own ruling line. Both preserved valuable information, and both organised that information according to political needs. The gap between them leaves Himiko in a remarkable position. She's historically visible but personally unreachable. We know that a female ruler conducted diplomacy with Wei. We know that her authority impressed foreign observers. We know that conflict followed her death before another young female ruler helped restore order. Yet we cannot point with certainty to her palace, grave, face, or real name. Even her title may be less straightforward than it appears. What Chinese scribes recorded as Himiko was their attempt to represent sounds from a language they did not speak natively. The name could have been personal, ceremonial, or connected with a religious office. The woman herself may never have heard it pronounced exactly as modern readers do. This is the point where Himiko begins to attract the larger mystery surrounding Japan's ancient stones. If such a powerful ruler can disappear from later records, perhaps entire civilizations could disappear as well. If the capital of a 3rd century kingdom remains disputed, how could we expect to locate a complex society from 12,000 years ago? The comparison is reasonable up to a point. History is incomplete. Political centres can vanish. Wooden architecture decays. Coastlines move. Later builders erase older settlements. A society does not need to be imaginary, merely because its name is absent from surviving documents. Yamatai, however, left clues belonging to its own time. Chinese diplomacy, bronze mirrors, yayoi settlements, early tombs, imported pottery, agricultural systems, weapons and regional exchange all belong to a connected archaeological world. The debate concerns which known pattern should be identified with the written kingdom. An advanced civilization before the end of the last ice age would require a much older pattern. People were certainly living in the Japanese archipelago during the ice age. They made stone tools, hunted animals, gathered plants, travelled across landscapes that no longer exist, and crossed stretches of water. As the climate warmed, pottery appeared very early, and communities developed the long traditions now grouped under the Jomon period. The UNESCO-listed Jomon sites in northern Japan document sedentary hunter-fisher-gatherer communities and complex ritual practices developing from about 13,000 before the Common Era to around 400 before the Common Era. These societies built settlements, cemeteries, storage facilities, stone circles, artificial mounds and communal structures without relying on the full agricultural state system seen later. The earliest Jomon communities therefore lived close to the end of the last ice age. They witnessed major environmental change. Forests spread into areas that had once supported colder ecosystems. Animal populations shifted, rivers changed, the sea began covering low coastal plains. During the post-Ice Age marine rise known in Japan as the Jomon transgression, shorelines moved inland and eventually reached levels higher than those of some earlier periods. Settlements that had occupied low coastal ground could be flooded, buried or destroyed. The official archaeological record recognises that this sea level change reshaped Jomon environments over thousands of years. Some unknown sites must now lie beneath the water. That is not speculation in the dramatic sense. It follows directly from the fact that people live near coastlines that no longer exist. The question is what those missing sites contained. They may have been small camps, fishing locations, shell processing areas, boat landings, villages, cemeteries, or places used only during certain seasons. Some could be larger settlements built from timber and earth. A few may eventually surprise archaeologists with structures, trade connections, or ritual arrangements more complex than expected. It is also possible that important coastal centres have been lost, leaving inland communities to represent a civilization that depended heavily on the sea. Maritime networks can be difficult to reconstruct when their ports are underwater and their boats have decayed. This gives a reasonable foundation for expecting future discoveries. It does not yet provide evidence for stone cities, advanced machines, or a global Ice Age empire. The word civilization causes much of the confusion. It can mean a society with cities, writing, kings, specialised labour, farming, and formal government. It can also be used more broadly for any complex culture with shared knowledge, art, trade, and social organisation. By the broader meaning, sophisticated Ice Age societies certainly existed. People possessed detailed environmental knowledge, maintained long-distance relationships, travelled by water, organised rituals, and passed skills across generations. By the stronger meaning proposed in lost civilization theories, the claim becomes much harder. A civilization capable of building and transporting the world's largest megaliths should leave specialised tools, production waste, quarries, settlements, food systems, roads, harbours and repeated construction traditions in securely dated Ice Age layers. Japan has not produced that pattern. Ishi-no-Hoden, Sakafune-ishi, Kame-ishi, Masuda-no-Iwafune, Ishibutai, and the Great Kofun all fit more recent cultural landscapes. Their dates may not be exact to a single year, and their functions may remain partly unknown, but they do not need to be moved back 10,000 years to explain their existence. Mount Nokogiri and Oya demonstrate what historical stone industries could achieve. Osaka Castle demonstrates that enormous blocks could be transported with boats, timber, ropes, prepared roads, and organised labour. The Kofun mounds demonstrate that early rulers could mobilise communities on a scale that seems impossible when the work is imagined as one single action. Yonaguni remains more uncertain because geology and possible human modification overlap underwater. Even there, no confirmed evidence connects the formation with a global Ice Age civilization. The strongest possibility is not that every Japanese megalith was built by one forgotten people. It is that later cultures repeatedly inherited landscapes containing older sacred places, quarries, natural formations, settlement grounds, and stories. A Jomon community might honour a rock or mountain. A Yayoi settlement might occupy the same route because it remained useful. A Kofun ruler might choose an already important landscape for a tomb. An Asuka court might build ritual water facilities near older sacred ground. A shrine could preserve the place while changing the name of the deity associated with it. This would create continuity without requiring one unchanged civilization. Memory can survive in habits as well as stories. A path remains a path because generations keep walking it. A spring remains sacred because no one remembers a time when it was not. A large stone remains untouched because every community inherits the warning that moving it would be unwise. Eventually the earliest reason disappears, but the behaviour remains. Could myths about gods, heavenly ancestors, turtle stones, divine builders, and submerged lands contain fragments of events reaching back to the Ice Age? Possibly, but a fragment cannot be treated like a dated document. Stories absorb new religions, political needs, natural disasters, and the imagination of every storyteller who receives them. A flood legend might preserve memory of rising water. It might also describe a recent tsunami, a river disaster, a moral lesson, or a world renewal myth with no connection to one specific event. The most responsible approach is neither to dismiss stories nor to use them as proof before archaeology supports them. They can guide questions. They cannot answer those questions alone. Himiko stands much closer to us in time, and even her story demonstrates how quickly memory changes. Within a few centuries, a queen recognized by China no longer appeared clearly in Japan's own account of its beginnings. Her kingdom became a name without an agreed location. Her mirrors became unidentified objects distributed among tombs. Her burial mound became a choice between several candidates. If that much uncertainty can surround the 3rd century, the last Ice Age will naturally contain larger gaps. But gaps are not empty containers into which any explanation can be placed. They are areas where the evidence remains incomplete. Perhaps the next major discovery will come from a submerged coastline, a preserved wooden structure, a sealed cave, or an underwater settlement could reveal a maritime community unlike any currently known. Perhaps new dating will show that people modified a formation much earlier than expected. Archaeology has changed its mind before, and it will do so again. For now, the available evidence suggests a long and complicated history, rather than one forgotten origin. Japan's ancient megastructures were built by different societies for different reasons. Quarry workers extracted stone for cities and fortifications. Kofun engineers raised mounds for rulers. Asuka craftspeople carved ritual systems, tomb components, and monuments. Castle builders reused older material and moved giant blocks to display political power. Coastal communities may have used natural formations that later disappeared beneath the sea. We often do not know their personal names. We do not know every tool sequence or ceremony. Some projects were abandoned before completion. Others were changed by later generations until their original purpose became difficult to see. That uncertainty is real, and it is enough to make the sites fascinating without requiring certainty about a prehistoric global civilization. The people behind these works were not primitive figures standing helplessly before stone. They were surveyors, quarry workers, carpenters, rope makers, sailors, potters, cooks, ritual specialists, political organisers, and labourers. They understood their materials through experience. They divided enormous tasks into thousands of smaller movements. They worked inside social systems powerful enough to turn a hill into a tomb or a cliff into a building supply. The mystery is not that ancient people could build. The mystery is how their knowledge was organized, what beliefs justified the effort, and why some monuments mattered enough to consume years of human life. Perhaps Yamatai was in Kyushu. Perhaps it was in the Nara Basin. Perhaps the name described a political centre whose influence extended across both regions through alliances and exchange. Himiko may rest inside a mound already known to us, protected by trees and water while modern roads pass nearby. Or her tomb may be smaller, damaged, reused, or waiting beneath a place no one has connected with her yet. Whatever the answer, she belongs not to an isolated mystery but to a transition. Behind her stood the long Jomon world, changing environments, maritime travel, local ritual, and communities rooted in different regions. Around her were yayoi farmers, bronze workers, traders, warriors, and rival rulers. After her came the builders of the first enormous Kofun and the growing authority of the Yamato state. She did not need to inherit a machine from an Ice Age empire to be extraordinary. Her power came from organizing people, ritual, diplomacy, and memory at a moment when Japan was becoming visible to written history. And so, after walking through mountain quarries, standing beneath burial stones, circling unfinished monoliths, looking over moats, and descending into the water at Yonaguni, we return to the question that began our journey. Who built Japan's ancient megastructures? There is no single answer, because there was no single group of builders. Some are known through records, some can be identified through archaeology, others survive only through the tool marks they left behind. The deeper mystery is how many hands, communities, and forgotten decisions exist inside every monument we try to explain with one name. The stones do not prove that an advanced civilization ruled the world before the Ice Age ended, but they do remind us that human history is older, more capable, and less complete than the simple timelines we sometimes carry in our heads. Coastlines have vanished, buildings have decayed, rulers have lost their names, entire industries have fallen silent, yet the heaviest parts remain, resting on hillsides, beneath forests, inside castle walls, and under the moving sea. Perhaps that is why they continue to hold our attention. They do not give us a clear message. They give us enough evidence to keep asking careful questions. And now, as the last stone settles quietly back into the landscape, think about which place stayed with you most. Was it the floating mass of Ishi-no-Hoden, the hidden chambers beneath Oya, the enormous mound of Daisen Kofun, or the terraces fading into blue water near Yonaguni? Wherever you are listening from tonight, I hope this journey through Japan's older world gave you something interesting to carry into sleep. If it did, you can leave a like, subscribe to Just About Earth, and return whenever you feel like wandering through another corner of history that has not quite finished explaining itself. For now, let the quarries grow quiet, let the tombs remain beneath their trees, and let the sea move slowly above whatever still waits below. Sleep well, fellow traveller.